The stagecoach hit a rut so deep that Eleanor Hayes bit down on the inside of her cheek, and the copper taste of blood filled her mouth before she even had time to brace herself. She pressed one hand against the wooden side panel and used the other to keep her hat from sliding off entirely. Across from her, a heavy-set man in a canvas duster had been sleeping with his mouth open for the better part of 3 hours, undisturbed by the jolts and lurches that had Eleanor's spine feeling like a length of rope pulled too tight. Outside the smudged window, the Colorado mountains rolled in every direction, enormous and indifferent, and nothing at all like the flat, predictable farmland she'd grown up on in Ohio. The peaks were beautiful, she supposed, in the way that things are beautiful when they don't need you and don't particularly want you there. Snow clung to the upper ridges even though it was late April. The pines were so dark green they were almost black. Eleanor had been in motion for 11 days. Train from Columbus to Kansas City, another train west. Then this coach, which smelled of tobacco and something organic she had decided not to investigate. Her trunk was strapped to the roof. Inside it, 2 dresses, her mother's quilt, a small portrait of herself taken 3 years ago when she'd still looked like a woman who expected good things, a tin of biscuits that were no longer edible, and 31 letters tied with brown kitchen twine. The letters were from a man named Caleb Marsh. She had written to him first, responding to an advertisement in the Columbus Dispatch that she'd read and reread so many times the newsprint had gone soft at the folds. Widower, 34, Colorado Territory. Established property. Seeking a capable woman of good character for honest partnership and shared life. No pretense, only sincerity. She had sat at the kitchen table for an hour before writing a single word. She was 30 years old. She had outlasted 2 engagements, one to a man who drank and one to a man who didn't drink but probably should have, given his temperament. And she had spent the last 4 years keeping house for her older brother and his wife, who were not unkind but who also never let her forget, in small and consistent ways, that the house was not hers. Caleb's first letter had taken 3 weeks to arrive. It was 2 pages, written in a hand that started neat and got progressively more sprawling as it went, as if the formality of the opening had worn off. He described Black Creek, the altitude, the winters, the way the creek froze solid by December, and the ice made sounds at night like something walking on it. He described his property, a cabin on the eastern edge of town, 40 acres of rough land, a barn that needed work. He did not oversell any of it. That, more than anything, had made Eleanor trust him. They wrote to each other for 9 months. She knew, reading back through those letters now, that she had done a thing people in difficult circumstances often do. She had assembled a man from the evidence available, filling in every gap with something favorable. Caleb's silences she'd interpreted as thoughtfulness. His infrequent mentions of emotion she'd read as restraint, which she'd told herself she admired. The fact that he'd never once asked her anything too personal, she'd taken as respect. The coach driver called down from the box. "Black Creek, 15 minutes." Eleanor straightened her hat. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and felt the fabric of her traveling dress, which was brown and practical and had survived the journey better than she had. She thought about what she would say when she saw him. She'd written out various versions of that first conversation in her head. Casual versions, warmer versions. One version where she said something dry and a little funny, and he laughed. She had not written a version where anything went wrong, because she was tired and 30 years old and had used up most of her capacity for that kind of preparation. Black Creek came into view around a long bend in the road, wedged into a valley between 2 ridges. It was smaller than she'd imagined. The main street ran maybe 3 blocks, a hardware store, a saloon, a building with a painted sign she couldn't read from this distance, a few others. Scattered houses climbed partway up the eastern slope. Smoke rose from several chimneys. There was a church at the far end of the street, white-painted, its steeple crooked. The coach rolled to a stop in front of what appeared to be a livery stable. Eleanor waited while the heavy-set man across from her woke up and pretended he hadn't been sleeping. A younger man who'd been wedged into the corner all the way from Glenwood helped her down from the step without being asked, which she appreciated. She stood on the main street of Black Creek with her trunk at her feet and looked around. There was no one waiting for her. She waited 20 minutes. She watched 3 men carry lumber out of the hardware store. She watched a dog cross the street with the slow dignity of an animal that owned the place. She watched a woman in a blue dress come out of the building with the painted sign, a dry goods store, she could read it now. and look at Eleanor with the specific expression people reserve for strangers who are standing somewhere they clearly don't know where they're going. "Help you with something?" the woman asked. She was maybe 45, with gray at her temples and a no-nonsense set to her jaw. "I'm looking for Caleb Marsh," Eleanor said. "He was supposed to meet me. I've come from Ohio." The woman's expression shifted, not dramatically, just a small tightening around the eyes. "You'd better come inside," she said. Her name was Ruth Dawson. She ran the dry goods store with her husband, who was out on a delivery run. She sat Eleanor down at a small table near the back, among sacks of flour and bolts of calico, and she poured 2 cups of coffee that were strong enough to strip paint, and she told Eleanor what she knew. Caleb Marsh had left Black Creek roughly 6 weeks ago. Nobody knew exactly when. He'd just been there 1 week and gone the next. He owed money to at least 3 people in town, including the man he'd bought seed from the previous spring and the woman who'd done his laundry. He'd left without settling any of it. His cabin on the eastern edge of town was sitting empty, as far as Ruth knew. He never mentioned, Eleanor started, then stopped. She picked up the coffee cup. It was too hot, and she drank it anyway. He never mentioned difficulties in his letters, financial difficulties. Ruth Dawson looked at her with something that was almost, but not quite, pity. "Men often don't," she said. Eleanor sat with that for a moment. Through the store's front window, she could see the main street, the mountains beyond, the heavy gray sky that had been threatening rain since morning. She thought about the 31 letters upstairs in her trunk. She thought about what it cost to travel here. She thought about what waited for her in Ohio, her brother's house, her sister-in-law's careful politeness, a life that fit her the way shoes fit when they're someone else's. "Is there a women's boarding house?" she asked. "There's a room above the saloon. Mrs. Pruitt rents it out sometimes. It's clean enough." "And the cabin? Could someone stay in it?" Ruth looked at her steadily. "It's not much, but it's standing. There's no claim on it that I know of, not officially. Caleb never owned the land outright, rented it from Henry Foss. Henry's a fair man." Eleanor set down the coffee cup. "Can you tell me how to get there?" Ruth gave her directions. Eleanor thanked her, picked up her trunk. It was heavy, and she'd rather have gotten help, but she didn't ask, and walked east through town toward the edge where the buildings thinned out and the land opened up again into rocky grass. She found the cabin without too much trouble. It was worse than she'd imagined. The porch sagged on the left side, one of the boards completely rotted through. The door hung slightly off its upper hinge. One of the 2 front windows had been stuffed with rags where the glass had broken. The barn out back was in better shape, oddly, sturdier built, though it was empty, no animals. The 40 acres of rough land stretched away north and east, mostly untamed, a few scraggly rows of something that had been planted and then abandoned. Eleanor set her trunk on the porch, testing the boards carefully before she put her full weight down, and pushed the door open. The inside smelled of cold ash and something else, something she didn't immediately identify. The main room was dim, a table, 2 chairs, one with a broken leg propped against the wall, a black iron stove with the ash door hanging open, some pots, a shelf with a few tins, a narrow cot against the far wall with a blanket on it. She stepped inside. The sound came from behind a door she hadn't noticed at first, a second room, barely more than a closet, at the back of the cabin. It was soft, intermittent. She thought, briefly, that it was an animal, a cat maybe, or a fox that had gotten in somehow. She pushed the door open. The baby was lying in a wooden crate lined with a folded blanket. It was awake, barely. Its eyes were open and fixed on nothing in particular, the way very young babies look when they are too hungry or too tired or both. A boy, she thought, though it was hard to tell at this age. He looked to be maybe 3 months old, possibly a bit older. His lips were dry. When the light from the doorway hit him, he turned his head toward it, and he made the sound again. Not crying exactly. More like the idea of crying, as if he'd been at it long enough that the energy for real noise had run out. Eleanor stood in the doorway of that small, dark room for a long time. Then she said, out loud, to no one in particular, "Well." She went back to the main room. She found a pot that was reasonably clean. She went outside to the pump, which worked after some persuasion, and she brought water in and set it on the stove. She built a fire from the wood stacked beside the cabin. There wasn't much, but there was enough. While the water heated, she went back to the small room and picked up the baby. He was lighter than she expected and heavier than she wanted. He smelled bad, which was understandable given the circumstances. He looked up at her face with an expression that was not trust, exactly, but something like cautious attention, the look of someone who has been let down enough times to suspend judgment. "I don't know whose you are," Eleanor said to him, "and I don't know what I'm going to do." He didn't answer, obviously, but he stopped making the soft, not quite crying sound, and he kept looking at her face. She warmed some water, found a cloth that was tolerably clean, and did what could be done. She searched the cabin more thoroughly and found a tin of condensed milk on the back of the shelf, barely touched. She didn't know if it was still good. She didn't have many options. She heated some and coaxed it into the baby using the cloth, which was slow and messy and not much more efficient than no method at all. But eventually he took enough that he seemed less urgent. She sat on the floor of the main room with the baby in her arms and looked at the four walls of the cabin that was not hers, in the town where no one was waiting for her, in the mountains that didn't care whether she was there or not. She thought about Ruth Dawson at the dry goods store. She thought about going back into town and telling someone what she'd found. The sheriff maybe, someone official, someone whose job it was to sort out situations like this one. The baby made a small sound and curled his fingers around the thumb she hadn't realized she'd offered him. She sat there until the light through the rag-stuffed window turned orange and then gray. She didn't go into town that evening. Instead, she found enough wood to keep the stove going through the night, and she pulled her mother's quilt from her trunk, and she slept on the narrow cot with the baby on her chest because it was the only arrangement that seemed to keep him calm, and in the morning she would figure out what to do. That was what she told herself. In the morning. She went into town the next day, which was a Wednesday, and she asked around until she found the sheriff's office. The sheriff was a man named Cole Briggs, somewhere in his 50s, with a gray mustache and the careful manner of someone who had been delivering bad news for a long time and had learned to pace himself. He already knew about Caleb Marsh. "Heard he'd cleared out," Briggs said. He was leaning back in his chair looking at Eleanor with the kind of attention that was not quite pity and not quite suspicion, but somewhere in between. Had a feeling there might be a woman involved. He'd mentioned a while back that he was expecting someone. "He had a baby," Eleanor said. "In the cabin. Alone." A long pause. "How long alone, do you figure?" "Long enough." She didn't say more than that. She didn't think she needed to. Briggs rubbed the back of his neck. "No sign of a mother?" "None." "I'll ask around, see if anyone knows whose the boy is." He looked at his desk, then back at her. "In the meantime, what are you planning?" "I'm staying in the cabin," Eleanor said. "If no one objects, I'll speak to Henry Foss about the rent." "Eleanor?" He stopped, recalibrated. "Miss Hayes, this is not what you came here for. You don't have any obligation to—" "I know what I don't have," she said. Her voice was flat, not rude, just factual. "I'm staying anyway." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll let you know if I find anything about the boy." Henry Foss turned out to be a round-faced, soft-spoken man who ran the mill at the north edge of town. He listened to Eleanor's explanation without interrupting and didn't ask her any questions she couldn't answer. He looked at the baby, who was asleep in the piece of cloth Eleanor had fashioned into a rough carrier against her chest. "Caleb owed me 4 months' rent," Foss said. "I can pay going forward," Eleanor said. "I can't pay what's behind. That's not my debt." "No," Foss agreed. "It's not." He studied the baby again. "Who's the mother?" "I don't know. Sheriff Briggs is looking into it." He thought for a moment. "Cabin's not in great shape." "I noticed." "I'll send someone out to look at the porch. The hinge on that door is bad too." He quoted her a monthly rate that was not generous, but was not unreasonable. She accepted it. The first month was the hardest. She had some money, not much, but enough to get through the immediate crisis if she was careful. She traded labor at the dry goods store for store credit, stocking shelves in the early mornings before Ruth Dawson opened. She took in mending, sitting at the table by the window in the evenings with a lamp and a pile of other people's clothes that needed fixing. She learned the stove's moods. It ran hot on the right side and needed the damper adjusted twice as often as any reasonable stove should require. She fixed the porch board herself with wood she found in the barn and nails she bought from the hardware store, because she couldn't afford to wait for someone to do it for her. The baby, whom she had started calling Noah, for no particular reason except that she needed to call him something, and Noah was the name of a boy she'd been kind to once, years ago, who had reminded her in no way of this infant, but whose name she had always liked. Noah was a difficult baby in the specific way that babies are difficult when they have been left alone too long. He startled easily. He cried at sounds that shouldn't have bothered him. He slept in stretches of no more than 2 hours for the first 3 weeks, which meant Eleanor slept in stretches of no more than 2 hours for the first 3 weeks. And there were mornings she stood at the pump in the cold and genuinely could not remember what day it was. But he was also undeniably a person. He had opinions about being held. He preferred to be upright, not cradled. He liked the sound of wind against the window. When she sang to him, badly and mostly off-key, he went still and watched her face with an attention that was either appreciation or confusion, but felt, in those dim-lit evenings, like something. The townspeople were curious. They were not all unkind about it, but they were curious, and curiosity has a way of arriving with an edge on it. The woman who ran the laundry, her name was Greta Sauer, a German immigrant with 2 sons and an air of permanent efficiency, stopped Eleanor on the street one morning in early May, looked at Noah, and said, "He's not yours." "No," Eleanor said. "You know whose he is?" "Not yet." Greta looked at her steadily. "You're planning to keep him?" Eleanor shifted the baby against her chest. She hadn't planned anything, exactly. She'd been surviving one day at a time, which felt like a plan in the absence of a better option. "I'm taking care of him," she said, which was true and also avoided the question. Greta made a sound that wasn't quite a judgment and wasn't quite approval. "You need more milk than you're getting from the general store," she said. "My neighbor has a cow. She'll sell you what you need." That was the closest thing to an endorsement Eleanor received for the first several weeks. The men of the town, by and large, didn't say anything directly, but she noticed them noticing her at church. She attended, because not attending would be worse, even though the sermons put her to sleep. At the store. At the pump. She was aware that she was an object of speculation. The woman who'd come to marry Caleb Marsh, who'd found his cabin and his debt, and his abandoned child, and hadn't had the sense, or the means, some of them probably figured, to leave. She ignored it the best she could. She had work to do. By June, she had gotten the cabin into a condition she was willing to call home. The broken window was fixed, real glass, which had cost more than she'd wanted but less than she'd feared. The floor was cleaner. She'd built a rough shelf for Noah's things, the tin cup she'd started giving him water from, the 2 small pieces of fabric she'd sewn into something approaching toys, the blanket she'd made from an old wool coat that had been in the bottom of her trunk. Noah, at roughly 5 months, had opinions. He wanted to be held more than she had time to hold him, which was a problem she solved imperfectly by wearing him while she worked. He had decided she was his and communicated this by looking for her face whenever he heard her voice and crying. A real, full-volume cry now, nothing like that soft near silence she'd found him in, when she put him down somewhere he didn't approve of. She didn't let herself think too much about what it meant, the way he looked at her. She was practical about it, the way she tried to be practical about most things. He needed someone, and she was the someone available. That was the arrangement, except that it wasn't, quite. She knew it wasn't. There was the evening in late June when he'd started crying at dusk and wouldn't stop, and she'd walked him around the cabin for 2 hours, back and forth, and finally sat down on the floor against the wall because her legs gave out, and he'd cried himself almost to sleep against her shoulder. And she'd sat there in the near dark with his weight against her and felt something she didn't have a word for. Not happiness exactly, not relief, just a kind of settling, like something in her chest that had been held at a slight wrong angle had found its right position. She didn't examine that feeling too closely. She wasn't sure she trusted herself to. Sheriff Briggs found her in late July. He came to the cabin on a Tuesday afternoon, hat in hand, with the careful expression of a man about to say something complicated. "Found out about the mother," he said. Eleanor set down the pot she was holding. Noah was on the floor behind her, sitting up now. He'd figured that out 2 weeks ago and treated it as a considerable personal achievement, pushing a tin cup around with both hands. Her name was Clara Voss, Briggs said. Came to Black Creek last fall. She and Caleb had some kind of arrangement. She died in February, childbed fever. Eleanor took a breath. And no family? None that have come forward. She was from back east somewhere, but I can't trace it. Could have been running from something. Could just be that nobody knew where she'd gone. He paused. Caleb should have brought the baby to me the moment she died. He didn't. Instead, he placed that ad in the paper. Wrote letters to some woman in Ohio. The words settled over her like cold water. She turned around slowly and looked at Noah, who had gotten the tin cup lodged under the table leg and was expressing strong opinions about this situation. He brought me here for the baby, she said. Not a question. I think so, yes. She thought about the 31 letters, the 2 pages written in a hand that started neat and got more sprawling. The man who'd never asked her anything too personal. The proposition that had read, no pretense, only sincerity. She laughed. It came out short and not quite right. Miss Hayes, Briggs's voice was careful, you don't have any legal claim to the boy. I want you to know that going in. If someone came forward, family, someone with a real claim, I understand, she said. You've done right by him. What you've done here, that's not nothing. But legally, I understand, she said again. He left shortly after. She sat on the floor with Noah, who had given up on the tin cup and was now examining Eleanor's hand with both of his, turning it over, pressing her fingers one at a time. His nails needed cutting. She'd been meaning to do that. She thought about legal claims. She thought about what she'd told Greta Sauer. I'm taking care of him. She thought about the 31 letters and Caleb Marsh and the rut in the road that had made her bite the inside of her cheek. She thought about going back to Ohio. Noah looked up at her. He had dark eyes, darker than she'd have expected from a fair-haired baby. He made a sound that wasn't any word yet, but that was getting closer to words every week. Then he put her index finger in his mouth and bit down, experimentally, with the 2 small teeth he'd just grown. Ow, Eleanor said. He found this response interesting. That's mine, she told him. You can't just... No, give that back. He did not give it back. She sat on the floor of the cabin that had once belonged to a man who lied to her, in the valley between mountains that didn't care whether she was there, with a baby who wasn't hers biting her finger, and she made a decision she didn't articulate, didn't examine, didn't announce to anyone. She was staying, not because she had nowhere else to go, though that was still largely true, not because leaving felt impossible, though it would have been complicated, but because somewhere between that first night on the cot with his weight on her chest and this moment on the floor with his teeth on her finger, something had shifted that she couldn't shift back. And she wasn't sure, sitting there in the late afternoon light, that she wanted to. By September, she had settled into something that, from a distance, might have looked like a life. The work was still hard. The money was still tight enough that some weeks she ate less than she should have so that Noah could eat enough. The cabin had its problems, the stove, the drafty north wall, the way the mice came back no matter what she did. The town had its problems too, the way towns do, and being an unmarried woman raising an orphaned infant put her in a category that some people were generous about and others weren't. But the dry goods store kept giving her hours. Ruth Dawson had turned out to be exactly as no-nonsense as she looked, which Eleanor found restful. She didn't ask intrusive questions. She told Eleanor when she was doing something wrong in the stockroom and left her alone when she was doing it right. Henry Foss sent a man out to repair the north wall. He didn't raise the rent. Greta Sauer, who had 2 sons and an air of permanent efficiency, started leaving things at Eleanor's door occasionally. A jar of preserved peaches once, a piece of cloth she said she had no use for. She never made a big thing of it. Eleanor never made a big thing of thanking her. It worked for both of them. And Noah grew. He grew the way all babies grow, faster than seems possible when you're watching it happen from the inside. He crawled. He pulled himself upright against the table leg and stood, wobbling, with an expression of pure concentrated effort that made Eleanor more than once forget what she was doing and just watch. He was going to walk soon. She could see it coming, the way you can sometimes see weather coming over the mountains. She thought about Clara Voss sometimes. The woman who had died in February of childbed fever, leaving a baby in a cabin with a man who was already planning his exit. She thought about what Clara had wanted, what she'd hoped for, what she'd believed when she made whatever choice had brought her here. Eleanor hadn't known her and probably had no accurate picture of her, but she thought about her. She took care of Noah the way she imagined Clara might have wanted someone to. She didn't know if that was right or foolish or some mixture of the two. She did it anyway. The first hard winter came in October, which surprised her. She'd thought she had more time. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 2 days, and the mountains disappeared behind a wall of gray. She spent the last of her savings on extra firewood and 2 more wool blankets and a pair of proper boots for herself to replace the ones that had started splitting at the seams. She sat at the table the night the first snow came, Noah asleep in the small room that had become his, and she wrote a letter to her brother in Ohio. She told him she was staying. She didn't explain why, exactly, because the explanation was long and complicated, and also because she wasn't entirely sure he would understand it. She said only that she had found a situation in Black Creek that suited her, and that she intended to remain through the winter and probably beyond. She didn't mention Noah. She wasn't ready to put that into words for someone else yet. She sealed the letter. She sat there a while longer in the quiet, listening to the snow against the window and the faint sounds of Noah breathing from the other room. Whatever she'd come west for, she hadn't found it. She'd found something else instead. She wasn't sure yet what to call it. She got up and banked the stove for the night, and she went to bed, and she actually slept, deeply, for the first time in weeks. And when she woke in the morning, there were 4 inches of snow on the ground, and Noah was standing at the door of his room, holding the frame, looking at her with dark eyes and a very determined expression. "Don't," she said, before he could let go. He let go anyway. He took 3 wobbling, anarchic steps across the floor before sitting down hard on his bottom, with a look of tremendous surprise. Eleanor sat up in bed. She stared at him. He looked back at her. Then he held up both arms, which in his language meant, "Well, come on then." She went and picked him up. She held him longer than necessary. She didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that wasn't either too much or not enough. Outside, the snow was still falling. The mountains were still out there behind the clouds, enormous and indifferent. The cabin was cold in the morning way that cabins are, the kind of cold that burns off once the stove gets going. She put Noah down, though he registered his objection clearly. She started the stove. She put the kettle on, she found his cup and the tin of condensed milk and got his breakfast started, and he sat on the floor behind her and watched her move around the kitchen with the steady attention of someone who knows where their breakfast comes from. It was not what she'd come for. It was not what she'd planned. It was not easy, and it was not clean, and there were days, most days still, when the situation felt fragile in ways she couldn't fully name. But she was here. She had built this, such as it was, and she was not going to stop. The winter that year didn't ease up. It settled in like a debt that wasn't going anywhere. By November, the creek had frozen solid, just as Caleb's letters had described, and at night Eleanor could hear it from inside the cabin, a low creak and pop that traveled through the cold air like something trying to get out. She'd read those words in a letter once and imagined them as romantic. Standing at the window at 2 a.m. with Noah against her shoulder, listening to the ice make its sounds, she thought, romantic was a word invented by people who'd never spent a winter alone. Noah had started walking in earnest by mid-November. Not the 3-step lurch and sit of that first snow morning, but actual walking, purposeful, fast, with an alarming indifference to the corners of furniture. He walked into the table leg twice in the same afternoon and cried both times, and walked into it again an hour later, which told Eleanor something about his character she was not entirely sure she was ready to deal with. She was busy. That was the honest word for her life in those months. Busy in the way that leaves no room for much else, the kind of busy that you only understand is exhausting when it stops. She worked her hours at the dry goods store, which Ruth Dawson had extended into 3 mornings a week, when the volume of pre-winter orders came in. She took in sewing in the evenings, her needle moving through other people's fabric by lamplight while Noah slept. She kept the stove going, which was a job in itself. The wood needed splitting and stacking, and she'd learned to do it herself because asking someone for help cost something, even when the help was freely offered, and she was careful about what she owed. The cabin held. That was what she told herself on the harder nights. The cabin holds. She'd made small improvements over the months. A proper hook by the door for coats. A low shelf along the wall of Noah's room, just the right height for the things he was starting to reach for. A patch on the north wall that had stopped the worst of the draft, though not all of it. None of it was beautiful. None of it was the life she'd planned. But it was hers, in a way that her brother's house in Ohio had never been hers, and she had discovered that ownership, even the rough, provisional kind, did something to a person's spine. Noah made friends the way toddlers do, indiscriminately and with tremendous confidence. The hardware store owner, a taciturn man named Doyle, had given Noah a small wooden offcut to play with during one of Eleanor's visits, and Noah had treated this as a binding social contract. Every time she passed the store after that, he said "Doy" and pointed emphatically until she took him in. Doyle would nod once, ruffle the boy's hair, and go back to whatever he was doing. Noah was apparently satisfied with this arrangement. Greta Sauer's youngest son, who was 7 and named Edmund, had taken it upon himself to visit the cabin on Saturday afternoons. He claimed it was because his mother sent him, but Eleanor had noticed that Edmund's visits often lasted until she was making dinner, and Greta hadn't seemed to send him looking for anything in particular. She didn't make a thing of it. Edmund was serious and competent and had opinions about the proper way to stack firewood, which meant Eleanor could split and he could stack, and they got twice as much done in the same time without either of them having to admit they were helping each other. "Noah's getting bigger," Edmund said one afternoon, watching Noah attempt to climb the woodpile. "Yes," Eleanor said, and retrieved Noah before he made it past the second log. "My ma says you're doing all right," Edmund offered. Eleanor looked at him. He was watching the woodpile with great concentration, not her face. "Tell your mother I said thank you," Eleanor said. He nodded. They stacked the rest of the wood without talking about it further. The townspeople's opinion of her had shifted, she'd come to understand, from curious to something she didn't quite have a name for, a kind of guarded, provisional respect that she suspected could evaporate again if she made a wrong move, but that was, for now, there. She was not one of them. She didn't think she would be for a long time, possibly ever. But she was a known quantity, which was different and in some ways more useful. There were still people who made her aware, in subtle ways, that her situation was irregular. A woman named Harriet Bloom, who sat 3 rows ahead of Eleanor at the services she still attended out of social necessity, had a way of looking at Noah with an expression that managed to be both pitying and censorious simultaneously, as if Noah himself were the one who'd made a poor decision. Eleanor had decided to find this faintly funny because the alternative was to find it infuriating, and she had better uses for her energy. Sheriff Briggs checked in occasionally. He hadn't turned up any further information about Clara Voss's people, and as winter settled in, the chances of anyone coming forward shrank. He was matter-of-fact about it, never false hopeful. "Still nothing back east," he said one afternoon in December, standing on her porch in the cold because she hadn't invited him in. Not unfriendly, just cautious about what she normalized. "I wrote to a few places. No family registered for a Clara Voss in any of the areas I could check." "What does that mean officially?" Eleanor asked. "Officially?" He shifted his weight. "It means the boy doesn't have a legal guardian on record. It means the county could, in theory, make a determination about his care. In practice, it means nobody's making a move right now. But someone could. Someone could, if they had cause." He met her eyes. "You're giving them no cause, Miss Hayes. That's the best protection you've got at the moment." She thought about that after he left. No cause. The cabin clean, the child fed and healthy and clearly attached to her, the neighbors able to attest that she was managing. She was building a case, she realized, whether she'd intended to or not. The case for Noah being hers was made not once but daily, in the stacked firewood and the cut nails, and the mornings at the dry goods store, and the evenings at the mending pile. It wasn't enough. She knew that. It might never be enough if the wrong person decided to take an interest. But it was what she had, and she kept building it. January was the month she nearly quit. Not left. She didn't think she would leave. Not anymore. That option had closed somewhere she couldn't identify exactly. But there was a week in January when everything broke at once in the small accumulating way that doesn't make for dramatic stories, but that grinds a person down more efficiently than any single disaster. The stove stopped drawing properly and filled the cabin with smoke for 3 days before she figured out the flue damper had partially seized. Noah caught a cold that settled into his chest and kept them both awake for most of a week. She ran short on money in a way she hadn't since the first month, because the mending work had been slow over the holidays and her store hours had been cut when business dropped off after Christmas. She got a letter from her sister-in-law in Ohio. Her brother apparently had not been the one to write back. That was polite in the pointed way of people who want you to read disapproval between every line. "We are glad you are managing," the letter said. "It must be difficult in such conditions. Of course, if the situation becomes untenable, the room here is still available." She read the letter twice. Then she put it in the stove. It was not that the room wasn't real. It was not that Ohio wasn't an option. It was that untenable was doing a lot of work in that sentence. And the room in her brother's house had a specific quality she remembered clearly. The quality of being given rather than earned, of existing on someone else's sufferance, of being the kind of room where a woman could live indefinitely and still be a guest. She wasn't going back to that, but she sat at the table that evening after Noah was finally asleep, his chest still rattling faintly, but better, definitely better. And she put her forehead down on her folded arms, and she allowed herself, just for a few minutes, to be tired. Really tired. Not the tired you can walk off or sleep off, but the kind that lives behind your ribs and occasionally makes itself known. She was still there when the knock came at the door. She lifted her head. It was late, past 8, probably closer to 9. She went to the door. Ruth Dawson was standing on the porch with a covered dish, looking entirely unsurprised to be there, as if she'd decided to bring food to exhausted women at 9 in the evening on a regular basis and had simply been working her way down the list. "Boys sick?" Ruth asked. "Getting better," Eleanor said. "Figured." Ruth held out the dish. "Soup. You've got a pot on the stove?" Eleanor stepped aside. Ruth came in, looked around once without comment, lifted the lid off the pot Eleanor had been using to make Noah's medicinal broth, and poured in the contents of the dish she'd brought with the casual efficiency of a woman rearranging someone else's kitchen. "Sit down," Ruth said. "I'll pour." Eleanor sat down. Ruth poured the soup into 2 bowls. She'd apparently brought enough for 2, though Eleanor hadn't thought to notice that until now, and she set one in front of Eleanor and sat down across from her with the other and said nothing further, just started eating. Eleanor ate the soup. It was the best soup she'd tasted since she didn't know when. Potato and salt pork and something else she couldn't identify. Rich and thick and warm in a way that moved through her chest and loosened things she hadn't realized were clenched. They ate in silence for a while. The stove popped. From Noah's room came the faint sound of his breathing. "He's going to be fine," Ruth said. About Noah, not a question. "I know," Eleanor said. "You've been managing." Also not a question. "Mostly." Ruth looked at her over the rim of her bowl. "This winter gets to everyone," she said. "January especially. There's not a woman in this town who doesn't have a week in January she'd rather forget." It was not exactly comfort. It was more like information delivered evenly, which was Ruth Dawson's characteristic mode. Eleanor found it more useful than comfort. "Thank you," Eleanor said, "for the soup." "You're my best stock girl," Ruth said. "Can't have you getting run down." That was as close as Ruth got to sentiment, and Eleanor was beginning to understand that it counted for quite a lot. February came and the creek ice started giving off its sounds again in a different register, lower, which Doyle told her meant it was thinking about breaking. She looked forward to the creek breaking. The winter had felt, by that point, very long. Noah was fully recovered, healthier than before, as if the illness had burned through him and left something sturdier in its place. He was talking now, not in sentences but in words, sometimes 2 words together, with a vocabulary that leaned heavily toward things he wanted and people he recognized. L was Eleanor. Doy was Doyle. Ed was Edmund, which the 7-year-old pretended not to find flattering. He had a word for the cat that lived behind the dry goods store that Eleanor was fairly sure was profanity she must have said in his presence at an inopportune moment, but she couldn't be certain, so she let it alone. She was at the store one morning in early March when a man came in she didn't recognize. He was tall, maybe 40, with a dark coat that was too fine for Black Creek, and the kind of deliberate posture that comes from being important somewhere and wanting people to know it wherever you go. He bought nothing. He looked around the store, at the shelves, at Eleanor, at Noah on the floor playing with a wooden spoon, and then he left. Ruth watched him go from behind the counter. "You know him?" Eleanor asked. "No," Ruth said. "Then, go ahead and take Noah home today. I'll finish up here." Eleanor looked at her. "Why?" "I don't know that there's a reason," Ruth said carefully, "but an unfamiliar man in a fine coat, looking at a woman and her child, is a thing that tends to have an explanation." Eleanor carried Noah home. She didn't see the man again that day. But the next afternoon, a boy brought an envelope to the cabin door. Eleanor's name was on it, written in a formal hand she didn't recognize. She opened it at the table while Noah ate the bread and broth she'd made for his lunch. The letter was from a firm of attorneys in Denver. It informed her that a Miss Victoria Hale of Boston, Massachusetts, had retained the firm in relation to the matter of one Noah Marsh. That name made Eleanor's hands go still, the Marsh. The reminder that someone had already assigned the boy a last name that wasn't hers, and was seeking information about his current circumstances and welfare. Miss Hale was, the letter explained, the sister of Caleb Marsh, and had only recently become aware of Noah's existence. She intended to travel to Black Creek in the spring to assess the situation personally. The letter asked Eleanor to make herself available for a meeting. Eleanor read it 3 times. She set it down on the table and looked at Noah, who had gotten his broth in his hair at some point and was now regarding her with mild interest, the spoon in one hand and a piece of bread in the other. "Well," she said. He held out the piece of bread, which was his version of comfort. "Thank you," she said, taking it. "I'm not hungry." She gave it back. He ate it. He seemed satisfied with how this had resolved. She went to see Cole Briggs the next morning, letter in hand. He read it twice, which she'd noticed was his habit with things that mattered. "Victoria Hale," he said, "Caleb's sister." "You know the name?" "Only just. Caleb mentioned a sister once, maybe twice. Said she was back east. They weren't close, from what he said. She had money, and he didn't, and that kind of gap tends to get wider over time." He set the letter on his desk. She'd have a blood claim to the boy, legally, as the closest known family. Eleanor's hands were folded in her lap. She'd been practicing stillness since she read the letter the night before, keeping her voice and her body quiet because panic didn't help, and she couldn't afford anything that wasn't help. What does a blood claim mean, practically? It means a judge would likely consider it seriously. He looked at her steadily. It doesn't mean automatic. It means she'd have standing to petition. And if she petitioned, you'd have to show cause for why Noah should stay. What kind of cause? The kind you've been building for the past 8 months, he said. His attachment to you, your demonstrated ability to care for him, the community around him, the fact that taking him from you would cause the boy harm. Would that be enough? Briggs was quiet for a moment. It might be. It depends on the judge. It depends on Miss Hale. It depends on whether she's genuinely interested in Noah's welfare or whether she sees this as a matter of family property. He paused on the last word, in a way that made clear he understood the ugliness of it. Some people, when they discover there's a child they didn't know existed, they want to do right by it. And some people want to right a wrong, which is different, and not always about the child. Eleanor looked out the window. The street was muddy with early spring thaw. A woman was walking a dog on the far side. Ordinary morning. "I need to talk to someone about the legal side," she said. "I know a man in Glenwood," Briggs said. "Not a lawyer exactly, but he knows enough of the law and he's fair. I'll write to him today if you want." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Please." She walked home with the mud pulling at her boots, thinking about what kind of woman Victoria Hale was. The money kind, the power kind, the genuinely concerned kind, or some combination she couldn't predict. She thought about the word assessment, the idea of someone arriving to assess Noah's circumstances, as if his life were a property to be evaluated, as if Eleanor were a caretaker to be reviewed. She thought about what she'd built in the last 8 months. The repaired porch, the real glass in the window, the shelf in Noah's room, the hours at the store, the evenings at the mending table, the soup Ruth Dawson had brought in January, the way Doyle nodded at Noah as if he were a regular customer, the way Edmund stacked wood on Saturday afternoons without being asked. She thought about whether any of it would matter to a woman from Boston with money and attorneys and legal documents. When she got home, Noah was in the barn, the small enclosed yard behind it actually, which she'd started letting him use now that the worst of the cold had lifted, pushing a stick through the mud with the concentration of an engineer. He was dirty in the specific way that toddlers get dirty when left unsupervised for 7 minutes, which somehow involves multiple surfaces. He looked up when she came through the gate. "Elle," he said, his version of hello. "I see you," she said. She crouched down beside him. The mud was deep. She was going to have to deal with those boots. "I see you." He went back to the stick. He had a method. She could see it, the way he was trying to channel water from the puddle through a small trench he'd dug. She watched him work on it. He'd made actual progress. She thought about Victoria Hale, coming from Boston with legal documents and money and the standing to take this child away. She thought about what 8 months looked like from the outside. A woman with no legal tie to a boy, living in a cabin she didn't own, working 2 jobs, getting by. She thought about how that story could be told in a way that sounded precarious and insufficient. She thought about how the real story had almost no words. "Noah," she said. He looked up. "You are not going anywhere," she said. Her voice was calm. She meant it. He looked at her for a moment with those dark, unreadable eyes. Then he went back to his trench. She stayed there crouched in the mud beside him for a while, not thinking anything useful, just there. The mountains were out today, all the way around, sharp and very clear the way they get in early spring. The sky was the particular blue of cold that's almost over. It was not a good situation. She had no illusions about that. Victoria Hale was coming, and Eleanor had almost nothing on paper that mattered. And the law was not built to recognize what she and Noah had made, which was harder to prove than a blood tie, but more real to her than almost anything she'd known. But she'd built things before from worse than this. She'd arrived with 31 letters and a broken promise and no money and a baby who wasn't hers. And she'd built a winter and then another season and something that people in Black Creek recognized when they saw it, even if they didn't all have a name for it. She was not going to let one woman's attorneys from Denver undo that. She stood up. Her knees were wet from the mud. She looked at her hands, rough, a little cracked from the winter. Nothing like the hands of a woman in Boston with money and time. Working hands. She'd started to think of them that way. "Come on," she said to Noah. "You need a bath." "No," he said. "Yes. No." "You have mud in your ear," she told him. He reached up and touched the ear in question. He appeared to find this development more interesting than objectionable. He stood up and came with her, still carrying the stick. Inside the cabin, she heated water and dealt with the mud and got him clean and into dry clothes, and he sat at the table eating an apple while she changed her own boots and thought about what she was going to say to the man in Glenwood when Briggs sent him her way, and how to say it so that everything that couldn't be put on paper would somehow still be heard. It wasn't a clean situation. It never had been. The spring was coming on fast, and Victoria Hale was coming with it, and Eleanor had no way to know what kind of woman she was, or what she actually wanted. But she had 8 months of mornings and evenings and midnights, and mud-covered boots, and meals taken at this table, and a boy who said her name the way people say the names of things that belong to them. She had that. She would find a way to make it matter. The man from Glenwood arrived on a Thursday in late March, 2 weeks before Victoria Hale's letter said she expected to reach Black Creek. His name was Herbert Crane, and he was not what Eleanor had expected. He was maybe 60, small, with a neat gray beard and a habit of tilting his head to one side when he was thinking that gave him the look of a bird assessing a situation. He wore a good coat, but not an expensive one. He shook her hand the way he'd shake anyone's hand, without making a production of the fact that she was a woman alone. He read the letter from the Denver firm. He asked her a series of questions that were precise and not unkind. He took notes in a small book. "You have no legal status relative to the child," he said, at the end, which was what she'd expected. "What you have is an established relationship, a demonstrated history of care, and the potential support of community witnesses." "Is that enough?" He tilted his head. "Against a blood relative with resources?" "Uncertain. But it's not nothing. A court that's paying attention will look at the child's best interest, not just the genealogy." He paused. "What kind of woman is Miss Hale?" "I don't know," Eleanor said. "I've never met her." "What do you know?" "She has money. She hired attorneys before she even contacted me directly. She's coming a long way to look at a child she didn't know existed until recently. That could mean she cares about his welfare, Crane said. Or it could mean she cares about the idea of him. Those are different things. Eleanor nodded. She'd been turning that distinction over since she'd read the letter. When she arrives, Crane said, let her see everything. Don't hide the difficulty of the situation or the limitations of your means. She'll find them regardless, and it's better for her to see them framed by what's true, that you've built something real here despite real obstacles. People who are genuinely concerned about a child want to see honesty. People who are looking for grounds to take him will find grounds regardless. He closed his notebook. The only version of this situation that's in your favor is the true one. Eleanor walked him to the door. He stepped onto the porch and looked out at the yard, where Noah had left his stick from the morning's excavations propped against the fence post. The boy's happy, Crane said. It was not a question. Yes, she said. That's the most important thing you have. He put his hat on. I'll be reachable in Glenwood if you need me. She watched him go down the track toward the main road. The afternoon was cold but bright, the kind of day that promises spring without quite delivering it. The mountains were purple at this distance. She went back inside and started on dinner. Noah was in his room doing something involving considerable banging. She didn't investigate. She put a pot on the stove and thought about Victoria Hale, who would arrive in 2 weeks with her Boston money and her Denver attorneys and her blood claim to a boy who didn't know her name. And Eleanor thought, let her come. She stirred the pot. She listened to the banging from Noah's room and waited for whatever was going to happen next. Victoria Hale arrived on a Tuesday, which Eleanor had not expected. The letter had said the week of April the 14th, which Eleanor had interpreted as Thursday at the earliest, and she had planned to spend Wednesday getting the cabin into the best condition it was capable of achieving. She had not planned on Tuesday. Tuesday, she was at the dry goods store stacking a delivery of flour sacks when Ruth came to the back room door and said quietly, "There's a coach just pulled up. Woman in gray." Eleanor set down the flour sack. She wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at herself, which she couldn't do literally because there was no mirror back here, but she was aware of her appearance in the abstract. Work clothes, hair imperfectly pinned, hands that were going to have flour dust in the creases for the rest of the day. She took off the apron. There was nothing else to do. "Noah's in the corner," Ruth said, meaning the corner near the window where she'd set up a small space for him with a wooden box and a collection of scraps and objects he found interesting. Ruth had never formally acknowledged that Eleanor brought Noah to work sometimes when there was no other arrangement. She'd just quietly made space for him. "I know," Eleanor said. "Thank you." She walked through to the front of the store. The woman standing just inside the doorway was not what Eleanor had assembled in her imagination. She'd built something formidable and sharp-edged, a woman who wore her wealth like armor, who came in with her chin up and her mouth set. What she saw instead was a woman of perhaps 42 or 43, slim, in a gray traveling coat that was well made but dusty from the road, with dark hair showing threads of silver and a face that was, at this moment, doing the same thing Eleanor suspected her own face was doing, taking stock. They looked at each other across the length of the store for a moment. "Miss Hayes," the woman said. Her voice was level. New England vowels, the kind that clipped the end off words. "Miss Hale," Eleanor said. "You're early." "The roads were better than expected past Glenwood." A pause. "I apologize for not sending word ahead." She didn't sound particularly apologetic, but Eleanor didn't think she sounded dishonest either. She sounded like a woman who had made a practical decision and was stating it plainly. Eleanor could respect that, even if she didn't like the result. "Come in properly," Eleanor said. Can I get you something? We have coffee." "Please." Victoria moved further into the store, and her eyes moved with her, across the shelves, across the room, and then to the corner near the window where Noah was sitting with a collection of wooden spools, carefully arranging them in a line with the focused attention of someone doing important work. She went very still. Eleanor watched her, watched the stillness, the specific quality of it. Not the stillness of someone calculating, but the kind that happens when something lands on you without warning and your body hasn't caught up with your mind yet. "That's Noah,"
Eleanor said.
Victoria didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the boy, who hadn't noticed them yet. He was 17 months old now, solid and brown-haired with those dark eyes, and he moved his spools with careful deliberation, muttering something to himself that wasn't words yet, but had the rhythm of conversation.
"He looks like Caleb," Victoria said, finally. Her voice had changed. Not softer exactly, but different, less managed. "I wouldn't know," Eleanor said. She went to the back and poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them out. And by the time she returned, Noah had noticed Victoria and was studying her with the frank, slightly suspicious attention he gave all new people. He didn't cry. He hadn't been a crier since the early months, but he held his position and didn't move toward her. Victoria crouched down, which Eleanor hadn't expected. Most adults, meeting a strange toddler, either bent from the waist or stayed at full height and spoke downward. Victoria went all the way to his level, her fine gray coat pooling on the floor of the dry goods store, and looked at him straight on. "Hello?" she said. Noah looked at her. "No," he said, which was his response to a lot of situations that required him to assert himself. The corner of Victoria's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "Fair enough," she said. She stood back up. She accepted the coffee from Eleanor and drank it without comment. Eleanor watched her face and found it genuinely difficult to read. "I'd like to see where he lives," Victoria said. "Of course," Eleanor said. "But The walk to the cabin was not long, and Eleanor had the impression that Victoria was filing things as they went. The town, its condition, the people who glanced at them as they passed, the mud on the main street, and the mountains all around. She was the kind of woman, Eleanor thought, who was always gathering information. Probably she'd been doing it since before the coach stopped. She noticed that Victoria looked at people who looked at Eleanor. She noticed what those glances meant. The nods, the brief acknowledgments, the woman at the pump who said, "Morning, Eleanor," and then looked curiously at Victoria without saying anything further. Eleanor wondered what it read like from outside, whether it read like belonging. At the cabin, Eleanor opened the door and stood aside. Victoria went in. Eleanor watched her look at it. The main room, clean, organized, limited. The shelf she'd built. The table and 2 chairs, both with working legs now. The stove that ran hot on the right side. Noah's cup on the shelf near his things. The mending basket in the corner by the window. Victoria walked to the door of Noah's room and looked in. The low shelf along the wall. The crate that had become his bed, properly padded now. The things on the shelf. The tin cup, the fabric toys, the wooden spoon he'd appropriated as a favorite object. She stood there for a moment without speaking. "How long have you been in this cabin?" she asked. "Since the day I arrived," Eleanor said. "Almost a year." "You arrived expecting to marry my brother?" "Yes." Victoria turned from the doorway. Her expression was complicated in a way Eleanor didn't have enough information to parse. "And instead you found a baby." "And instead I found a baby," Eleanor confirmed. "Why didn't you go back?" Eleanor had been waiting for this question since the letter arrived. She'd thought about how to answer it. The strategic version, the version that sounded best, the version that emphasized her dedication rather than her circumstances. She'd prepared several answers. What she said instead was, "I couldn't." Victoria looked at her. Couldn't or wouldn't. At first couldn't, then wouldn't. By now I'm not sure the distinction matters. Victoria set her coffee cup on the table. She looked around the room again, slowly, as if she were memorizing it. "My brother was not a good man," she said. "I want to say that plainly, because I suspect you've spent the last year being charitable about him, and you don't need to on my account." Eleanor said nothing. "He was not cruel exactly," Victoria continued, "but he was careless. Careless with money, careless with people. Careless in the specific way of men who believe their problems are always someone else's to solve." She stopped. "I didn't know about the woman, Clara. I didn't know about the child. I don't know how much I should have known. Whether there were signs I missed because I wasn't looking, or whether Caleb simply never told me." She folded her hands in front of her. "I found out through a letter from one of his creditors in Black Creek, as it happens, who wanted to know if the family intended to settle his debts. The letter mentioned, almost in passing, that there was a child." Eleanor absorbed this. When did you receive it? December. She paused. I hired the attorneys in January, 6 weeks after receiving the letter before she'd moved. Eleanor noted that, but she didn't say anything. What do you want? Eleanor asked. Plainly, if you're willing. Victoria looked at her for a moment. She had the quality, Eleanor thought, of a woman who is used to being direct and also used to it costing her something. The specific straightness of someone who has learned that people often don't want the plain version. I want to know that the boy is cared for, Victoria said. That's the genuine answer. The attorneys are... She made a small, dismissive gesture. Lawyers make things legal. They don't make them right. I hired them because that's what you do when there's a legal question. That doesn't tell you what I intend to do with the legal question. Are you considering taking him? Eleanor asked. Her voice was steady. She was very careful about that. I'm considering what's best for him, Victoria said, which is what I came here to determine. And your initial determination? Victoria looked around the room one more time. At the shelf Eleanor had built. At the clean floor. At Noah, who had settled himself on the ground near Eleanor's feet with the wooden spoon and was doing something architectural with it against the table leg. I haven't made one yet, she said. I just arrived. Victoria was staying at Mrs. Pruitt's room above the saloon, which was the only option in Black Creek for a respectable woman traveling alone. Eleanor had half expected her to arrive with an entourage, or at minimum the Denver attorneys, but she'd come by herself with one large travel bag and the gray coat and the steady eyes that were always assessing. She came to the cabin again the next morning, which Eleanor had prepared for. The floor swept, Noah in clean clothes, breakfast made. Victoria arrived before Eleanor had quite finished her own coffee, which seemed consistent with her character. She sat at the table and watched Eleanor with Noah in the easy, observable way of that morning routine. The cup passed to him. The negotiation over what he would and wouldn't eat. He had strong feelings about oats, which were con, and bread, which were pro. The way she automatically kept half her attention on him while doing 3 other things simultaneously. Eleanor didn't perform any of it. She was too tired for performance and too proud for it. You work at the dry goods store, Victoria said, 3 mornings a week, and I take in mending. And that's enough? It's what there is. Eleanor looked at her directly. We're not comfortable. I won't pretend otherwise, but he's fed and warm and healthy, and I'm not in debt. Henry Foss holds the lease on this property. Eleanor didn't ask how she knew that. Yes, he's a fair man. I spoke with him yesterday afternoon, Victoria said. Of course she had. And? He said you've been a reliable tenant. He said you did work on the cabin yourself. The porch, the north wall. She paused. He seemed mildly to approve of you, in the way men of that sort approve of anyone, which is to say, with reservations and without enthusiasm, but without specific objection. Eleanor almost smiled. That was, she thought, a fairly accurate description of Henry Foss. I also spoke with Ruth Dawson, Victoria said, and with a woman named Greta Sauer. You've been busy. I told you I needed to make a determination. Victoria folded her hands on the table. Mrs. Sauer said, and I'm paraphrasing fairly closely, that woman has done more for that boy than most natural mothers I've known, and anyone who says different hasn't been paying attention. She then offered me preserved peaches, which I accepted, and changed the subject. Eleanor looked at the table. She hadn't known that. She'd known Greta left things at her door, but she hadn't known what Greta said about her, or to whom. She took a breath. Miss Hayes, Victoria said, and her voice had shifted slightly, the way it had when she first looked at Noah. That quality of something landing before the mind catches up with it. I can see what's here. I can see it plainly. Then why? Eleanor stopped. She started again. Forgive me. What is it that still needs determining? What I'm going to do about it, Victoria said. What role, if any, I should play. What I owe this child as his only blood family. What I owe you, as the woman who stayed when no reasonable person was obligated to. She looked at Noah, who was currently examining the underside of the table with great interest. And what Noah is owed, as a child who should not have been left in this situation in the first place, which is, ultimately, my family's responsibility. The last sentence had an edge to it that wasn't directed at Eleanor. It was directed somewhere else. At Caleb, maybe.
or at the situation, or at herself. Eleanor said carefully, "What are you proposing?" "I don't know yet." Victoria looked back at her. "I'm proposing that we continue talking, that I spend some time here and understand what's actually in front of me before I make any legal moves." A pause. "I'm also proposing that you stop looking at me like you're waiting for me to take him." Eleanor said nothing. "I'm not without sympathy, Miss Hayes. I am not here to dismantle something that's clearly working." She paused again, and for the first time something that might have been discomfort moved across her face. "I'm here because a boy I didn't know existed has no father and no legal standing, and a woman caring for him who has no legal protection either, and I couldn't in good conscience stay in Boston knowing that and doing nothing." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. "You could have sent money," Eleanor said. "Yes," Victoria said, "I could have." She didn't look away. "That's not the same thing as coming." Victoria stayed a week, then 2 weeks. Then, without any formal announcement, she simply continued to be in Black Creek, which meant she was staying. Eleanor wasn't sure what to make of it. She watched Victoria move through the town with the particular manner of a capable woman who is in an unfamiliar place and has decided to understand it rather than wait for it to come to her. She spoke with people, not obtrusively. She didn't make a show of her inquiry, but systematically, in the way of someone who has learned that useful information comes from conversations that don't look like investigations. She came to the cabin daily, sometimes in the morning, once or twice in the afternoon. She was not easy company. She had opinions and she stated them, which Eleanor found alternately refreshing and exhausting. She thought the shelf in Noah's room was poorly positioned. She thought Eleanor was underselling her mending work and should charge more. She thought Black Creek's main street needed drainage. Noah, for his part, had moved from cautious observation to something approaching tolerance of Victoria, which for him was rapid progress. He still said no to her with some regularity, but he had also, on one occasion, handed her the wooden spoon to hold, which Eleanor privately interpreted as a significant endorsement. But beneath all of this, beneath the daily visits and the opinions and the careful surveying of Eleanor's life, was the fact that Victoria had still not told her what she intended to do legally. The Denver attorneys were presumably still on retainer. The question of custody, of guardianship, of what best interest meant in the eyes of a court, none of that had been resolved, only suspended. Eleanor felt it, the suspension. Like standing on river ice in March, the ground beneath her was real and had held her all winter, but she could feel the change coming in the way the surface behaved, and she had no way to know whether it would hold another week. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks into Victoria's stay. Eleanor had put Noah to bed and was at the table with her mending when Victoria knocked and came in. She'd started doing that, knocking and then coming in, which was not exactly how Eleanor would have arranged things, but which she'd adjusted to. Victoria sat down across the table with a cup of tea she'd apparently made herself at some point because Eleanor certainly hadn't offered it. "I've been in correspondence with the attorneys," Victoria said. Eleanor set down her needle. "And? They believe a formal guardianship petition filed by me would succeed, given the blood claim and the resources available to me." She held the teacup. She did not look triumphant. She looked like someone delivering information she had complicated feelings about. "They also believe a challenge from you would be difficult to sustain over a protracted legal process." "I know that," Eleanor said. "Herbert Crane told you the same." "Yes." Victoria was quiet for a moment. Outside, the creek made its spring sounds, different from the winter ice, running now, fast with snowmelt. Noah had started calling it the loud water, which was accurate. "I'm not going to do it," Victoria said. Eleanor went still. "I'm not going to file the petition." Victoria set down the teacup. "I spent the last 3 weeks determining whether you were the right person to raise this child, and the answer is so obviously yes that I feel fairly foolish for needing 3 weeks to see it." Her voice was dry, but not unkind. "What's here is real. What you've built with him is real. And taking a child from a situation that is manifestly working, from the only mother he knows, because of blood and legal standing, that's not what the law is for, even when the law would permit it." Bostel. Eleanor realized her hands were flat on the table, pressed down hard. She made herself relax them. "Then what?" she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "Then I want to discuss what we can do that actually helps," Victoria said. Whether there's a legal structure that protects you, protects your position with Noah, makes it formal, makes it harder for anyone else to challenge. I have the resources to pursue that, and I'd like to, if you're willing to trust me that far. Eleanor looked at her. In 3 weeks, she had developed a complicated picture of Victoria Hale. Her directness, her intelligence, the way she covered discomfort with precision, the fact that she had come a very long way to do a hard thing she didn't have to do. She had also developed, reluctantly, something that felt like the beginning of respect. "You could have told me this 2 weeks ago," Eleanor said. "I could have. I wanted to be sure I meant it before I said it." Eleanor looked at the table. At the mending in her hands, someone else's shirt with a torn sleeve. At her working hands, rough and flour-dusted and cracked from the winter. "What kind of legal structure?" she asked. "There's such a thing as formal guardianship that can be established through a court, with supporting testimony. Given what people in this town are prepared to say about you and about Noah's welfare here, a petition for your legal guardianship of him stands a reasonable chance." Victoria paused. "It's not the same as adoption. That's a harder road. But it would give you standing. It would make you, in the eyes of the law, the person responsible for him, and the person entitled to make decisions for him." "And you?" Eleanor asked. Something shifted in Victoria's expression. "I would like to know him," she said simply. "If that's acceptable to you. I'd like to be the boy's aunt, in whatever way is possible from the distance between Boston and Colorado." A pause. "I'm his only blood family, and that's not nothing, but it doesn't outweigh what you are to him, I understand that." The fire popped in the stove. The creek ran outside. Eleanor thought about Clara Voss, who had died in February and left a baby in a cabin with a man who was already planning to leave. She thought about what Clara might have wanted, not just for Noah, but for herself, for the story of herself, for the fact that she had lived and loved and made a child and then been gone. She thought about Caleb Marsh, who had been careless with people, and about the 31 letters, and about the advertisement that had said no pretense. Only sincerity, and had been, it turned out, a lie in almost every particular. She thought about the 8 months she had spent building something with no guarantee it would stand. "If you're going to be his aunt," Eleanor said finally, "you should know that he's going to say no to you, frequently, about things that don't merit a no." Victoria's mouth moved in that direction that wasn't quite a smile, but had been getting closer over 3 weeks. "I had a brother who was the same way," she said. "I know how to wait it out." The petition was filed in the first week of May. Herbert Crane handled it from the Glenwood end, and Victoria's attorneys handled the formal correspondence. And Eleanor did not know exactly what they said in all those papers, but she knew that Ruth Dawson and Greta Sauer and Henry Foss and Cole Briggs had all provided written testimony, because each of them told her so, in their characteristic ways. Ruth said, "Told them what I know, which is enough." Greta said, "I told them the truth. That should be sufficient." Henry Foss said, "Wrote a page. Seemed like the thing to do." Briggs said, "Submitted what I had. Judge Ellison's a reasonable man. He'll read it." Eleanor thanked each of them. She did not make a big thing of it because they hadn't, and because making a big thing of it would have changed the nature of what it was, which was, she had come to understand, the way a community works when it works. Not drama, not public declarations, just people doing the thing because it was the right thing, and not requiring much acknowledgement for it. Victoria stayed in Black Creek while the petition was pending, which Eleanor had not expected. She had expected Victoria to return to Boston. The petition was filed. The wheels were turning. What reason was there to remain? But she was still at Mrs. Pruitt's room above the saloon, and she was still coming to the cabin, and she had, somewhere in the 3rd week of May, started helping Eleanor with the mending in the evenings. This was unexpected enough that Eleanor didn't address it directly for several days. Then one evening she said, "You mend?" "I mend," Victoria said without looking up. "I grew up without money, Miss Hayes. The money came later." Eleanor absorbed this. It rearranged several things she thought she understood about Victoria Hale. "The coat," Eleanor said, "the fine gray coat." "Is from the later period," Victoria confirmed dryly. They mended in silence for a while. The lamp threw its warm circle. Noah was asleep. The mountains were out there in the dark, as always, enormous and indifferent. "Why didn't you have children?" Eleanor asked.
It was probably too direct a question. She asked it anyway. Victoria's needle kept moving. I was engaged once, she said after a moment. He died. I was 26. After that, She paused. I put my energy elsewhere, into the business, into things I could control. Another pause. I don't regret most of it. I regret that I didn't know about Noah until December.
Eleanor looked at her. This woman who had come from Boston with legal documents and money and the power to upend everything, and who was sitting at her table in the lamplight mending a stranger's shirt because she had grown up without money and knew how, and who had given up a legal battle she could have won because she understood finally what was actually true. He's going to know you, Eleanor said. He'll forget that you weren't always here. Children are like that. Victoria looked up. Is that reassurance, or are you making a point about something? Both, probably, Eleanor said. Victoria looked at her for a moment, then she went back to the mending. Fair enough, she said, which was what she'd said to Noah on the first day when he'd told her no. Outside, something moved in the night. Wind in the pines, or the creek over its rocks, or one of the million sounds that the Colorado mountains made after dark that Eleanor had stopped trying to identify and had started simply hearing as the sound of where she lived. The petition was pending. The judge was a reasonable man. The spring was coming in fast now, the snow retreating up the slopes, the lower meadows going green. She had built a winter. She was building a spring. Whatever came next, she would build that too. She picked up the next shirt in the pile and found the tear, and threaded her needle, and across the table Victoria did the same, and the lamp burned steadily, and Noah slept in the next room with his wooden spoon, probably tucked somewhere near him, and outside the mountains waited with their particular version of patience, which was not patience at all but simply permanence, the kind that doesn't need anything from you, that will be there regardless. Eleanor had stopped resenting that about them. She was starting, slowly, to find it useful. The petition was still pending when the schoolhouse burned. It happened on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of June, which was the kind of afternoon that Colorado sometimes produces in early summer. Warm enough to be comfortable, with a breeze off the mountains and the sky that particular shade of blue that makes you forget the winter entirely. Eleanor had been in the yard behind the cabin splitting wood, because the summer supply needed building even while the air was still warm. And she'd sent Noah to spend the afternoon with Greta Sauer's boys 2 houses down, which had become a Thursday arrangement now that Edmund had appointed himself Noah's unofficial older brother, and Greta had more or less ratified the appointment. She heard the bell first, the one at the livery stable that served as Black Creek's fire alarm, 3 fast rings repeated, which she'd been told about when she arrived, but had never heard in actual use. She set down the axe and went around to the front of the cabin and looked down toward town. The smoke was coming from the eastern side of the main street, black and rolling, the kind of smoke that means something is burning fast and hot. She couldn't see the building yet from this angle. She was already moving before she'd made a conscious decision about it. The schoolhouse was on the eastern edge of the main street, a single-story wood-frame building that served the town's children twice a day, mornings for the younger ones, afternoons for the older, and had a small attached room at the back where the teacher, a young man named Porter, who'd come from Ohio the previous year and was still getting used to the altitude, kept his books and materials. The fire had started in the back room, Eleanor learned later. Porter had been using a lamp even in the afternoon because the back room had only one small window, and something had gone wrong. The lamp tipped, or the oil leaked, and the back room went up fast and the fire moved through the dry wood of the building the way fire does when it's very determined. Porter had gotten the older children out. He was good in a crisis, it turned out, better than his general air of mild bewilderment suggested. He'd gotten the 8 older children out the front door before the smoke made the front room dangerous. The younger children were in the side room. This was the thing that stopped everyone in the street when they understood it. The side room had its own door, but that door opened to the alley between the schoolhouse and the hardware store, and the fire had moved along the back wall and caught the corner of the alley side, and the door was jammed, warped from the heat already, or stuck on the uneven ground, or both. And inside that room were 6 children between the ages of 4 and 7 who could be heard, from the street, crying. Eleanor arrived at the same moment as maybe a dozen other people, all of them running from different directions. 2 men were trying the front door, but the front room was fully involved now, smoke pouring from the windows. Someone was shouting about water, but the creek was 200 yards away, and there was no organized bucket line yet. Porter was standing in the street with his 8 older students clustered around him, one hand over his mouth, looking at the building with the expression of a man whose mind has stopped working. Eleanor pushed through to the front. She looked at the building, and she looked at the alley, and she did a thing that was not brave so much as mechanical. The calculation happened too fast for bravery, which requires the awareness of fear, and she moved before the fear caught up with her. She went around the side. The alley was narrow, and the smoke was already thick along the top of it, the way smoke behaves in enclosed spaces. She pulled her collar up over her mouth, which helped some. The side door was wooden, plain, with a simple iron handle. She grabbed the handle, and the heat of it surprised her enough that she pulled back once. Then she grabbed it again, with her sleeve over her palm this time, and she pulled. The door didn't move. She pulled again, harder, putting her weight into it. The wood had swollen in the heat, and the frame was warping even as she stood there. Behind the door she could hear the children. Multiple voices, one of them screaming, one of them crying in a sustained, exhausted way that sounded like it had been going on a while. "Move!" She turned. Victoria Hale was in the alley behind her. She was in her good gray coat, which she had apparently been wearing when the bell rang, and her face was completely composed in the particular way it got when she was solving a problem and had no time for anything else. "Move!" Victoria said again, and Eleanor stepped aside, and Victoria looked at the door, and then looked at the alley wall, and found a loose board near the ground that she pried off with her bare hands, in a move that tore her glove and probably her palm, and then used the board on the door handle. Not as a lever, but as a striking tool, 3 hard blows to the corner of the frame where the warp was worst. The door shifted. Eleanor got her fingers in the gap and pulled. Victoria put the board in the gap and pushed. Something cracked in the frame, and the door came open wrong, one hinge giving out, and it swung out at an angle, and they had maybe 18 inches of opening before the remaining hinge held. 18 inches was enough. Eleanor went in first because she was slightly smaller, and it was her instinct. The smoke inside was heavy, but not yet at the floor, and she dropped low and moved toward the sound of the children. The room was maybe 12 by 12 feet. She found the first child by almost stepping on her, a girl of maybe 5, on her hands and knees near the door, who grabbed Eleanor's arm the moment she touched her with a strength that didn't seem possible for someone that size. "Door," Eleanor said, keeping her voice as even as she could. "I've got you. Come on." She got the girl to the door. Victoria was there, half inside, and she took the girl and got her into the alley, and Eleanor went back in. The second time was harder. The smoke was thicker and lower. She could feel the heat from the back wall of the room. The fire was through it now. She could see orange light through the gaps in the boards, and the wood was popping and cracking in the specific way that means the structure is thinking about what comes next. She found 2 more children huddled under the teacher's low table at the back of the room. Smaller ones, maybe 4 years old, and she got one under each arm, and she did not allow herself to think about the back wall. She got to the door. Victoria took 1 child. Eleanor pushed the other through the gap. 3 out. 3 to go, and the back wall was making sounds she didn't like. She went back in. Her eyes were streaming and her lungs were starting to complain in a serious way, a tightness that wasn't just discomfort. The floor was hot under her boots. She found the child who'd been screaming, a boy, she thought, though she couldn't see well enough to be sure, by following the sound which had gone to a corner near the window. He was not going to come with her willingly. She could feel that in his body when she grabbed him, all resistance, the pure animal panic of a small person in a terrible situation. She held on, and she moved toward the door. She hit the door frame with her shoulder instead of clearing it, and it hurt in a distant way that she noted without stopping. She got through. Victoria was there. Her coat was off now. She'd used it to carry the 2 smaller children to safety and had come back. And she took the screaming boy from Eleanor with both arms and held on and moved. 2 more. Eleanor went back into the smoke. This was the one she didn't tell people about afterward because it wasn't a story that made sense from the outside. The room was almost too dark now, the smoke at the floor, and she was on her hands and knees, and she couldn't hear them anymore over the sound of the fire eating through the back wall. She moved in a systematic way across the floor, left, then right, then further, and her hand found a foot and followed it to a child and then found, beside that child, a second one who was sitting against the far wall with his arms wrapped around the first child's shoulders in a way that said he'd been trying to protect her and had run out of ways to do it. He was maybe 7.
He looked at Eleanor through the smoke with red-rimmed eyes. "Can you move?" she asked. "Yes," he said. His voice was absolutely steady, which undid her later when she had time to think about it. "Then move," she said. "Low, follow me." He moved. He kept his arm around the smaller child. Eleanor took her other side, and the three of them moved together across the floor in the direction Eleanor thought the door was, and the back wall gave out with a sound like a statement, a section of it falling inward in a shower of burning debris, and the room lit up orange, and Eleanor had enough time to understand that there was only going to be one chance at this. They came out the door into the alley in a rush that was not elegant. Eleanor got her shoulder on the frame again in the same place, which was going to leave a mark. The boy tripped on the warped threshold, and she caught him by the back of his shirt without thinking. Victoria was right there. She had come back a third time, and she got the small girl, and Eleanor got the boy, and they moved down the alley and out into the street where the air was relatively clear, and there were people everywhere, and then they stopped. Eleanor put her hands on her knees. She breathed. Beside her, she could hear Victoria doing the same. Two women trying to get air into lungs that had just been treated very badly, in a street full of people who were staring at them. After a moment, Victoria said with some difficulty, "Your shoulder." "I know," Eleanor said. "You hit it twice." "I know," Eleanor said. She straightened up. The schoolhouse was fully involved now. There was no saving it. The whole back half was gone, and the front half was going fast. Men were making a bucket line from the creek, which would matter for keeping the fire from spreading to the hardware store, but was not going to save the building. The children were all accounted for. She counted them automatically, the habit of a woman who has spent 18 months tracking one small person at all times. 6 children from the side room, all of them alive. The boy who had been steadier than he should have been was being held by a woman who was crying loudly. His mother, Eleanor guessed, who had his face in her hands and was saying something Eleanor couldn't hear over the general noise of the situation. He was letting her, which was a good sign. Eleanor looked at Victoria. Victoria's hair had come down entirely. The pins lost somewhere in the alley. Her hands were scraped, the right one bleeding along the palm where she'd pried the board from the wall. Her dress was ruined. She looked, in other words, like someone who had just done something difficult in the real world, as opposed to the composed and precisely dressed woman who had walked into Ruth Dawson's dry goods store 6 weeks ago to make an assessment. "Your hand," Eleanor said. Victoria looked at it as if she'd forgotten it was there. "It's fine," she said. "It's bleeding." "I'm aware." I said, "It's fine." Eleanor looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." Victoria looked back at her. Something moved in her face that was complicated and not entirely readable, the way important things often aren't. "Don't thank me," Victoria said. "I almost didn't come in." "But you did?" "Yes." A pause. "I did." Well, the town's response to the fire was the kind that builds its own story as it goes, each person who tells it adding what they saw, what they heard, which angle they were watching from. Eleanor heard several versions of the alley sequence over the following days, and they were all slightly different and none of them entirely wrong. What remained consistent across all of them was this: Eleanor Hayes and Victoria Hale, together, had gotten 6 children out of a burning building. The fact that they'd done it together was what people talked about. Not separately, not Eleanor and then Victoria, but together, as if the town had needed to see them as a pair before it could make sense of either of them individually. Eleanor noticed this. She thought about what Crane had told her. The only version of this situation that's in your favor is the true one. She thought about how the true version of herself had never been something she could explain to a stranger, but apparently it was something people could see when it happened in front of them. She didn't pursue that line of thinking too far. It felt like the kind of thing you could talk yourself into relying on and then be surprised when it wasn't enough. The petition was still pending, but things had changed in the way that things sometimes change in a small town after a shared event. Quietly, without announcement, at the level of how people greeted each other in the street and whether they met your eyes. The woman at the pump said "good morning" differently now. Doyle at the hardware store nodded at Eleanor with a degree of warmth he hadn't previously managed, and offered her a handshake, which she accepted, and that was that. Harriet Bloom, who had spent 8 months looking at Noah with that specific expression, stopped Eleanor on the street 4 days after the fire. Eleanor braced herself. "That boy," Harriet said. "Is he well?" "He's well," Eleanor said. "He wasn't there." "No, I know. I meant generally." She had the expression of a woman who wants to say something and is making herself say it correctly. "You've done well by him. I want you to know that I see it." Eleanor looked at her. "Thank you, Mrs. Bloom." "I was not always," Harriet started, then stopped, then tried a different approach. "It wasn't a conventional situation." "No," Eleanor agreed, "but not all situations are." She nodded once, decisive, as if settling an internal argument. "Good morning, Miss Hayes." "Good morning, Mrs. Bloom." It was not an apology exactly, but it was something. Victoria came to the cabin that evening with her hand bandaged. She had let someone look at it, finally, and sat at the table and did not mention the fire except obliquely, in the way she handled things that had moved her more than she was comfortable showing. "I wrote to the attorneys today," she said. Eleanor looked up from the stove. "I told them to proceed with the guardianship petition as a supporting document. I also told them to investigate the possibility of a more formal legal arrangement." She put both hands on the table, the bandaged one on top. "Adoption." The word was in the room. Eleanor turned fully from the stove. She looked at Victoria. "I want to be clear that I'm not proposing this to take anything from you," Victoria said, and her voice had that quality of someone stating a thing they've prepared carefully because they know it matters. "I am proposing it because the guardianship gives you rights, but the adoption gives him a name. And this child deserves a name that belongs to him." She paused. "Hayes, if you were willing." Eleanor put one hand on the edge of the stove and kept it there. She needed something to hold on to. "That's a harder road," she said. It was what Crane had said. It was the first thing that came out of her mouth. "Yes, I know. That's why I'm asking whether you want to try for it, not whether you want the result." "Those aren't separate questions," Eleanor said. "No," Victoria agreed. "They're not." Eleanor thought about Noah, asleep in the next room with his wooden spoon somewhere in the blankets, the child who said no to things that didn't warrant it and held his arms up when he wanted to be carried and called the creek the loud water and had walked 3 steps across a cold floor in November and sat down hard and looked up at her like, "Well, come on then." She thought about what it would mean for him to have a name on paper, for the name to mean something the law recognized, for there to be no question, no pending petition, no possibility that someone else, someone she hadn't met yet, some other branch of Caleb Marsh's careless life, could arrive with a legal claim and start this whole process over again. It would take time, Eleanor said. Probably a year, possibly more. And the outcome isn't guaranteed. No. But we have community support. We have my resources behind the legal costs, and we have the record of your care for this child over nearly 2 years. Victoria looked at her steadily. We have a reasonable chance. Eleanor looked at the door to Noah's room. She looked at her own hands, the working ones, the ones that had built the shelf and fixed the porch and pulled children through an 18-inch gap in a burning door. We, she said. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said simply. We. Eleanor sat down at the table across from her. Not because she'd made a decision yet. She hadn't, not entirely. The weight of it was too much to decide in one conversation at a kitchen table at the end of a difficult week. But she sat down because sitting down meant she was staying in this conversation, which was itself a kind of answer. Tell me what you know about the legal process, she said. All of it, Victoria told her. It took a long time. The lamp burned down and Eleanor lit another. Outside, the creek ran over its stones with its summer sound, louder than winter, lower than spring snowmelt, settling into the particular register that was just the creek being itself. Noah woke once, briefly, and made a sound that meant he was looking for confirmation that the world was still in order, and Eleanor said from her chair without getting up, It's fine, I'm here. He went back to sleep. The formal hearing before Judge Ellison was scheduled for a Thursday in late July. It was not, strictly speaking, about adoption. That process was longer and more involved and had only just been initiated. It was about guardianship,
about establishing Eleanor's legal standing as the person responsible for Noah, which was the necessary first step before anything else could be built.
Eleanor dressed carefully that morning. Not her best dress. She didn't own a best dress. She owned practical dresses and less practical dresses. And she chose the least practical one, which was dark blue and had been her mother's and which she'd packed at the last minute and almost left behind. She did her hair properly. She looked at herself in the small piece of mirror she kept above the washstand and thought, "This is the face I have. It will have to do." Victoria came for her at 8. She was wearing gray, the good coat mended now, her hair perfectly arranged. She looked at Eleanor and said, "You look well," which was not excessive praise but was not nothing, and then she looked past Eleanor at Noah and said, "He needs his collar fixed." "I know," Eleanor said. "He keeps pulling at it." "Noah." Victoria crouched down to his level, which she did automatically now, not the formal gesture of that first day in the dry goods store, but something habitual. "Come here." He came, which was itself something. 18 months ago, he'd said no to her from across the room. Victoria straightened his collar with brisk efficiency. He stood still for it with the expression of someone allowing a thing they consider unnecessary. "There," Victoria said. "No," Noah said, on principle.
You see.
Eleanor watched this exchange and felt, briefly, the thing she felt sometimes now when she looked at the two of them together. Not the anxiety of the first weeks, the constant vigilance against threat, but something quieter and more complicated. Victoria was not his mother. Eleanor was his mother, in every way that mattered to either of them. But Victoria was something, and Noah was beginning to know what that something was. And the three of them had built a shape together in the last 3 months that she hadn't planned for and couldn't have predicted and was having difficulty naming. She was not going to name it today. Today she needed to walk into a judge's hearing room and make a case for her son, and she needed her full attention on that. They walked down into town, the three of them. It was a bright morning, the sky clear, the mountains all the way around. Eleanor noticed people watching as they passed. Not the curious watching of a year ago, but something different, something that carried with it the weight of the fire and the weeks before it and all the ordinary days that had added up to this one. Ruth Dawson was standing in the door of the dry goods store. She nodded once at Eleanor. Not a nod that said good luck or I'm with you in so many words, but a nod that meant something close to both of those things. And Eleanor nodded back, and that was enough. Greta Sauer was on the street with Edmund. Edmund looked at Eleanor with the solemn attention of a 9-year-old who understood that something important was happening and had decided to observe it properly. "Go well," Greta said. Short, direct, Greta's characteristic register. "Thank you," Eleanor said. The courthouse, such as it was, a room at the back of the town hall with a judge's bench and 6 chairs for spectators, was not large. Judge Ellison was a spare man in his 60s with wire glasses and a deliberate manner of speaking that suggested he had learned over the years that the speed of speech and the quality of thought were not the same thing. He had read the petition. He had read the testimony. He asked Eleanor questions, some of them about the facts of her arrival in Black Creek and her assumption of care for Noah, some of them about her current circumstances, some of them that were less about facts and more about, she thought, her, who she was, how she thought about things. He asked, "You came here to marry a man you'd never met." "Yes." "And when that situation collapsed, you stayed." "Yes." "Why?" She looked at him directly.
Because he was there and he needed someone, and I was the someone available. Ellison looked at her over the wire glasses. That's the reason you stayed? Initially? Initially, yes. And now? She thought about the right way to say it, the strategic version, the version that would read best in whatever notes the judge was taking. She thought about what Crane had told her. The only version of this situation that's in your favor is the true one. Now, she said, he's my son. That's the whole answer. The judge looked at her for a moment. He made a note. He asked several more questions, practical ones, about finances and housing and her plans going forward, and she answered them honestly, including the parts that weren't impressive. He asked Victoria about her role, her intentions, her relationship to the child. Victoria said, I am his blood aunt. I intend to be a presence in his life in whatever capacity Miss Hayes finds appropriate. I have no desire and no intention to challenge or undermine her position as the person who has raised this child. She paused. She is his mother. The law should reflect what is already true. After that, Judge Ellison asked to see Noah. Noah came in. Eleanor had left him with Herbert Crane in the hall, which had been arranged in advance, with the careful attention he gave unfamiliar rooms. He looked at the judge. He looked around the room. He looked back at Eleanor. Elle, he said. His version of, I see you, you see me, we're all right. Yes, she said. Come here. He came and stood beside her and put one hand on her knee, which was his current preferred method of physical contact when he wasn't sure about his environment. He looked at the judge with the expression he used for new people he hadn't decided about yet. What's your name? Ellison asked. Noah considered this. He looked at Eleanor. She nodded. No, he said, which may or may not have been an answer. The corner of Judge Ellison's mouth moved. He made a final note. He told them he would render his decision within a week. He stood, which meant everyone else stood, and then he looked at Eleanor one more time over the wire glasses. You've done well by this child, he said. It was not the ruling that was coming later, but it was something. Eleanor said, Thank you, Your Honor. She walked out of the courthouse into the July morning with Noah's hand in hers and Victoria at her left side and the mountains all around, and she felt the suspension again. The river ice feeling, the sense of standing on something that had held all winter and all spring and was still holding, that she still couldn't know for certain would hold another week. But it had held this far. She looked down at Noah, who was already done with the courthouse and the formal mourning, and was looking at a dog across the street with great interest. Not now, she said. He looked up at her. Later, she said. He accepted this, temporarily. She held his hand and walked toward the main street of Black Creek, and behind them the courthouse sat in the July light, and somewhere inside it a judge was making a note. And somewhere ahead of them was the week before the ruling, and Eleanor thought she had survived worse weeks than this. She had survived January. She had survived 31 letters and a broken promise and a winter alone. She had survived the fire and the petition and the presence of a woman from Boston who could have taken everything. She had built things from worse than this. She kept walking. Judge Ellison's decision arrived on a Wednesday, which was not a day Eleanor had assigned any particular meaning to, but which she would remember afterward with the specific clarity that attaches itself to ordinary days when something important happens in them. She was at the dry goods store, as she was most Wednesday mornings, stacking a delivery of dry goods that had come in on the Tuesday coach. Noah was in his corner with the wooden box and a collection of objects Ruth had accumulated for him over the months. A set of large wooden buttons, a tin that rattled when you shook it, a piece of rope tied into a loose knot. He was 18 months old and deeply occupied with the tin, which he shook, set down, regarded seriously, and then shook again, as if expecting different results each time. The envelope came with the boy who ran messages from the town hall, a 12-year-old named Silas, who performed this duty with the self-importance of someone carrying state secrets. He handed it to Eleanor without ceremony and stood there waiting. You don't have to wait, Eleanor told him. Mr. Crane said to wait, Silas said. Ruth Dawson appeared from behind the counter. She looked at the envelope and then at Eleanor and said nothing, which was her way of offering something. Eleanor opened the envelope. The language was legal, which meant dense.
and she read it twice before the meaning separated itself from the form. When it did, she read that sentence again, the operative one, the one that began, "It is hereby ordered," and she stood in the dry goods store with flour dust on her hands, and Noah shaking his tin behind her and Ruth Dawson watching her from the counter, and she felt something she did not immediately have a name for. It wasn't relief exactly, though relief was part of it. It wasn't triumph. It didn't feel like winning because the version of the story where she was fighting and this was a victory was not quite how she'd come to understand what she and Noah were. It was something closer to the feeling she'd had on the floor in November when he walked his 3 anarchic steps across the cabin. Not happiness, not relief, just the settling of something that had been held at a wrong angle into its right position. The court had granted legal guardianship. Eleanor Hayes was, in the eyes of Colorado law, the person responsible for Noah. The petition had been supported by the testimonies of Ruth Dawson, Greta Sauer, Henry Foss, Cole Briggs, and Herbert Crane, whose letter had apparently been thorough enough that Judge Ellison had quoted from it in his written decision. It noted the child's clear attachment to his guardian, the quality of care demonstrated over nearly 2 years, and the stable home and community that had been established. It noted in language that was judicial and therefore dry, but that Eleanor read as its own kind of statement, that the law existed to serve the best interest of children, and the best interest of this child was plainly served by the arrangement already in place. She folded the letter. She looked at Silas. "Thank you," she said. "Tell Mr. Ellison's clerk I received it." Silas departed, slightly disappointed by the lack of visible drama. Eleanor turned around. Noah had gotten the tin open. She didn't know how he'd managed that. The lid had been stiff, and was examining the contents with the expression of a scientist whose experiment has yielded interesting data. She went to him. She sat down on the floor beside him, in the corner of the dry goods store with the flour sacks and the bolts of calico, and she picked him up and held him, which he permitted briefly before squirming in the direction of the open tin. "In a minute," she said. He stilled. He had gotten better at reading her voice. Not just the words, but the register beneath them, the way she sounded when she was tired or anxious or when she meant something, and he seemed to understand that this was a mean-it moment, because he settled against her shoulder and looked at the tin with patient interest. She held him for about 60 seconds. Then she set him down and he went back to the tin, and she stood up, and Ruth Dawson said from the counter, not looking up from the ledger she appeared to be examining, "Good news, I take it?" "Yes," Eleanor said. Ruth made a small sound that could, from the right angle, be interpreted as satisfaction. She did not look up from the ledger. She went to find Victoria. Victoria was at Mrs. Pruitt's room, which she still had, though the definition of staying in Black Creek had shifted over the last month from temporary assessment visit to something that neither of them had named out loud yet, but that had the quality of permanence. She had written to business associates in Boston. She had received letters back. She had replied to those letters. The specific content of this correspondence she had not shared with Eleanor, and Eleanor had not asked, because there were things she understood about Victoria that she hadn't understood in April. Among them, that Victoria processed decisions internally and announced them when they were made, not while they were still being made, and that pressing her before she was ready produced resistance rather than information. Eleanor knocked on the door of Mrs. Pruitt's. Victoria answered in the way she always answered, which was immediately and fully dressed, as if she had been waiting. Eleanor handed her the letter without preamble. Victoria read it. Her face did what it did. The stillness, the quality of something landing before the mind catches up. And then she handed it back. "Ellison's a good judge," she said. Her voice was even. "Yes," Eleanor said. "He is." A pause. Victoria looked at the window, which faced the main street, and therefore showed, at this hour, the ordinary morning business of Black Creek going on around them. "The adoption process," Victoria said. "Herbert says 2 years, potentially longer." "I know." "You're prepared for that." "I was prepared for 31 letters, and a man who turned out to be nothing like them," Eleanor said. 2 years is manageable." Victoria's mouth moved. "Fair point." She turned from the window. "I want to fund the legal costs, the full process. I want that to be clear and formalized, not a favor I extend and then withdraw." Eleanor looked at her. They had been navigating this particular territory carefully for weeks. The money, what it meant to accept it, what it changed, and what it didn't.
In exchange for what? Eleanor asked. Not accusatory, practical. In exchange for being his aunt, Victoria said. The legal costs for the right to know him. That's what I'm proposing. Eleanor thought about it. She thought about what it cost her to accept and what it cost Noah for her not to, and about the difference between those two things. All right, she said. Victoria nodded once, the way she nodded when something was settled. Then she said quieter, I'm glad it went through. I want you to know that. I know, Eleanor said. I wasn't sure early on. I want to be honest about that. She looked at Eleanor directly, the way she always did when she was being honest about something that cost her. When I came here, I had genuinely not decided. The attorneys, the legal claim, I was prepared to use it if the situation warranted it. If the child was not well cared for, if the woman caring for him was, she paused, insufficient. And, Eleanor said, and you were the least insufficient person I'd encountered in a long time, Victoria said. It was not a compliment in the conventional sense. Coming from Victoria, it was something better. Eleanor looked at her, this woman who had arrived in April with a legal claim and a fine gray coat, and the capacity to undo everything, who had pried a board off a wall with her bare hands and gone back into a burning building 3 times, and sat at a table in the evenings mending other people's shirts, and had turned out to be, underneath all of it, someone who had grown up without money and knew what it was to build things from less than you needed. Come to dinner tonight, Eleanor said. I'm making something that might be stew if it goes well, and will be soup if it doesn't. Victoria's mouth moved again, fully this time, the smile she'd been withholding since April finally making its full appearance, which was briefer than expected and better for being so. What time? She asked. That evening, over the stew that had gone well, more or less, Eleanor told Noah about the letter. She did not explain it in legal terms because he was 18 months old and legal terms were not going to serve. She told him, while she helped him with his spoon, that he was going to stay here, in this cabin, with her. He looked at her with the dark eyes that she had stopped trying to trace back to Clara Voss or Caleb Marsh or anyone else, because they were his eyes now, as far as she was concerned. Elle, he said. Yes, she said. He went back to his stew, apparently satisfied. Victoria, across the table, said nothing. She was watching Noah with the expression she had when she was feeling something she hadn't found the correct language for yet. Eleanor had learned to leave those moments alone. After dinner, after Noah was in bed, they sat at the table with the last of the coffee and the comfortable silence that had developed between them over 3 months of evenings. Eleanor thought about what the next 2 years looked like. The adoption process, the legal steps, the testimonies, and the hearings and the forms, all the formal architecture of a thing that was already, in every real sense, true. What made you stay? Eleanor asked. Not about the adoption, about Black Creek. Victoria turned her coffee cup in her hands. I told myself I was staying to see the guardianship through. And that was partly true. She looked at the table. I've spent 20 years building things from a distance. In Boston. Very efficient, very controlled. Things you can manage with letters and money and well-chosen representatives. A pause. I came here and I saw someone building a thing up close, with her hands, in the middle of conditions that were not favorable, and She stopped. You what? Eleanor asked. Victoria looked up. I forgot for a while what that felt like, she said simply. I hadn't done anything with my hands in 20 years. When I pried that board off the wall, she looked at her right palm, the scar still pink and new. I'd forgotten. Eleanor looked at her own hands, the working ones, the flour-dusted, rough-edged ones. I think some things you have to keep doing, Eleanor said, or you forget they're possible. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. I think that's right. Yes. The summer moved through its paces the way Colorado summers do, fast and bright, and then suddenly tilting toward fall with a speed that always surprised Eleanor, even when she knew it was coming. By August, the petition for adoption had been formally filed through Herbert Crane and Victoria's Denver attorneys, working in parallel, which Crane said was the most efficient arrangement he'd seen in 20 years of frontier legal work. The process was underway. The timeline was what it was, and Eleanor had made her peace with waiting,
which was something she'd had to learn the same way she'd learned everything else in Black Creek, imperfectly, over time, through necessity. Noah turned 2 in what Eleanor estimated was September, though the exact date was unknown, and she'd chosen September 15th as a working birthday, which he celebrated by receiving a wooden horse Doyle had carved over the course of 3 weeks, a fact he'd mentioned to no one, and which Eleanor discovered only when he produced it the morning of the 15th, with the air of a man who has been keeping a sensible secret. Noah held the horse for a very long time and then took it to show Victoria, which was, Eleanor thought, a significant statement about the current shape of his world. Things changed in the town, slowly, in the way things change in small places, which is not like a door opening, but more like a season turning, gradual until it's suddenly obvious that something is different, and you can't say exactly when it became so. A new schoolhouse was being planned, to replace the one the fire had taken. Victoria had, without announcement, contributed substantially to the building fund. Eleanor heard this from Ruth Dawson, not from Victoria, which was characteristic. The new building was to be larger than the old one, with 3 proper windows on the south side and a real floor rather than the packed earth of the original. It would be finished by spring. Eleanor was asked to serve on the planning committee, which met once a month at the town hall. She almost said no. The habit of staying at the edge of things was still in her, the careful management of how much space she occupied. But Ruth Dawson had looked at her in a specific way when the question was raised, and Eleanor had said yes. And it turned out that serving on committees was not so different from stacking flour sacks or mending shirts, which was to say, it was unglamorous work that mattered in specific practical ways. And Eleanor was good at that kind of work. The judge in Glenwood who handled the adoption case was not Ellison. It was a different court's jurisdiction, an older woman named Crane who was no relation to Herbert, who read everything submitted and asked questions that were sharp and occasional and required precise answers. Eleanor appeared before her twice over the course of the process. Both times she felt the weight of being assessed, and both times she answered exactly as she had answered every question in this situation since the very beginning, with the truth in its plainest form without embellishment or apology. She had decided, somewhere in the second year, that the truth was the only thing she'd ever actually had to offer. Not money, not family name, not legal standing, not the kind of respectable social position that made things easier. Only the truth of what she'd done and what it had made day by day, without guarantee. She had decided to stop finding this inadequate. The adoption was granted on a morning in the March of Noah's 3rd year, which arrived with a late snowstorm that deposited 8 inches overnight and left Black Creek temporarily white and very quiet. Eleanor read the decision at the table with the stove going and Noah still asleep and the snow piling against the window glass. The language was legal and therefore dense, and she read it twice, and then she set it down and sat very still for a moment. Noah Hayes. It said so in the document, not as a proposal or a recommendation, but as a fact, recorded and ratified and official. Noah Hayes. She sat with that for a while. When he woke up, she told him. Not in legal terms and not in the language of what had been difficult or uncertain, because he was 2 years old and the difficulty was hers to carry, not his, and always had been. She told him only that his name was Noah Hayes, which was her name, and he said no because he said no to a lot of things before he said yes, and then he said with some thought, Noah Hayes. That's right, she said. He appeared to find this acceptable. He picked up the wooden horse and took it to the window to look at the snow. She sent Victoria a note, which was what you did in Black Creek when you needed to communicate something before you were ready to say it out loud. Victoria arrived in 20 minutes in her coat and boots with snow on her shoulders, which meant she'd come directly from wherever she was when the note reached her. Eleanor handed her the decision. Victoria read it, standing in the doorway, still in her coat, with snow melting off her shoulders onto the floor. Eleanor watched her read it and watched her face and found, in it, something she recognized, the same thing she'd felt herself, sitting at the table with the stove going. Not triumph, the settling, the something at a wrong angle finding its right position. Noah Hayes, Victoria said. Yes, Eleanor said. Victoria looked up from the document. Her eyes were dry, which was characteristic, and bright, which was less so. I want to celebrate, she said. Something proper. It's snowing, Eleanor pointed out. I'm aware of that.
The roads to Glenwood are closed. I'm not proposing Glenwood. Victoria folded the document carefully and handed it back, and Eleanor noticed that she handled it the way you handle something that matters. Not reverent, just careful. I'm proposing dinner here, tonight, with whatever this cabin can produce, and the people who made this possible. Eleanor looked at her. That's a large group.
Smaller than you think, Victoria said. The people who actually moved the needle. Ruth, Greta, Herbert, if he can get here, though the snow will probably prevent it. Cole Briggs. She paused. Doyle. Doyle doesn't come to social events. He'll come to this one, Victoria said, with a confidence Eleanor decided not to question.
She was right. Doyle came. They all came, in the early evening, through the snow, which had stopped falling by afternoon and lay clean and white over the valley, and the rooftops and the mountains, making everything look temporary and new. Ruth Dawson brought bread because Ruth Dawson brought bread to things the way other people brought their opinions. Greta brought the preserved peaches that had apparently become her contribution to occasions of significance. Cole Briggs came in his good coat and shook Eleanor's hand and looked at Noah for a long moment and didn't say anything, which said enough. Edmund, Greta's son, 10 now, grown an inch since the previous winter, took up a position near the door as if he'd been assigned it, which possibly he had assigned himself. Doyle stood in the main room of the cabin holding a cup of coffee and looking at the walls and the shelf and the window with the real glass, and at the wooden horse on the low shelf in Noah's room, and he did not say anything either, but he stayed the whole evening, which was its own statement. They ate at the table, not all at it. There weren't enough chairs. People sat where they found themselves. On the cot, Eleanor had moved to the main room for the occasion, on the floor with their backs against the wall like it was the most natural thing. The stove put out its reliable lopsided heat. Noah circulated among the guests with the wooden horse and the absolute confidence of a child who has never spent a moment unsure of his welcome. Eleanor stood at the edge of it and looked at the room and thought about the way things accumulate. Not like a plan being executed, but like a stream finding its course, each small thing directing the next, until you look back at the distance covered and it seems both inevitable and impossible. She had not planned any of this. She had not planned to stay in Black Creek, had not planned for Noah, had not planned for Victoria or for Ruth's soup in January or for the fire, or for the slow, imperfect construction of something that now fit her the way places fit you when they're actually yours. She thought about what she would tell someone if someone asked her what she had learned from the last 2 years. She had been turning this question over for a while, not in a philosophical way. She was not, by nature, a philosophical person, but in the practical way she turned over most things. What she'd learned was this, that you cannot wait for permission to belong somewhere. You can arrive in a place with every door closed against you and no claim on anything, and if you work and you stay and you show up the same way tomorrow as you did today, something shifts that is not permission exactly, but is better than permission. It's the simple fact of having been there, of having done the thing, of being someone this place knows. You can't buy that or argue for it or inherit it. You build it the same way you build a shelf or fix a porch or coax a fire out of a stubborn stove, imperfectly, with the tools you have, doing it again when it doesn't work the first time. She had also learned that belonging is not the same as being accepted. She had spent the first months of her life in Black Creek waiting to be accepted, treating the town's opinion of her as a verdict that could be issued or withheld, a door that could open or stay closed. It had taken a long time to understand that she'd had it backward. She'd built a home, and then she'd built a life in it, and then she'd been there for 2 winters, and at some point in that accumulation she had stopped being a stranger. Not because the town decided she wasn't, they hadn't issued a verdict, but because a stranger is someone who hasn't been anywhere long enough to matter, and she had been in Black Creek long enough to matter to the people who mattered to her. That was what belonging was. Not an award, a fact. She had learned that help is complicated and pride is expensive, and that the calculation of what to accept from whom and on what terms requires more honesty than most people are comfortable with. Victoria's money had made the adoption possible. Eleanor had spent a long time with the discomfort of that, turning it over, looking for the angle at which it stopped being complicated. She had finally decided that the angle didn't exist. It was complicated. It would stay complicated, and that was all right. The alternative was to refuse the help and fail the thing that mattered most, and that was not a trade she was willing to make. And she had learned, this was the hardest one, the one she kept coming back to, that the people you end up with are almost never the people you came looking for. She had come to Black Creek for a man she'd assembled from letters. What she'd found was a baby in a wooden crate, and a woman who ran a dry goods store and brought soup at 9 in the evening, and a German woman who left peaches at your door without making anything of it, and an old man who carved a horse over 3 weeks and then produced it on a birthday as if it were nothing. She had found Victoria, who was infuriating and honest and had gone back into a burning building and had grown up without money and knew how to mend things. She had not found what she was looking for. She had found something else entirely. She had been making that trade for 2 years, and she had not once regretted it. But toward the end of the evening, when the guests had begun to drift toward their coats, and the stove was burning lower, Eleanor found herself standing near the window with Victoria, looking out at the snow. The main street was white and still. The mountains were out, the last light catching their upper slopes. "What are you going to do?" Eleanor asked. She meant about Boston, about the question neither of them had addressed directly for months. Victoria was quiet for a moment. She looked at the street, at the mountains, at the snow. "I've been in correspondence with a man in Denver," she said. "There's a business there, a dry goods concern, in fact, which seems fitting, that's looking for an investor with operational experience." She paused. "Denver is closer to Black Creek than Boston is." Eleanor looked at her. "I'm not proposing to move into your cabin," Victoria said, with the dryness that was her characteristic mode for things that moved her. "I'm proposing to be close enough to be useful, and to know Noah in a way that letters and annual visits don't allow." She turned from the window. "If that's acceptable to you." Eleanor thought about it. She thought about what the last year had looked like with Victoria in it. The difficulty of it, the discomfort of the early weeks, the way they'd circled each other, the fire, the evenings at the table, the thing they had built that she still didn't have an exact name for. "It's acceptable," she said. Victoria nodded. She looked back at the window. "He's going to need more room soon," she said. "That cabin." "I know. Henry Foss might sell. He mentioned the parcel north of the current lease. More land, bigger house." Eleanor looked at her. "You spoke to Henry Foss about my property." "I spoke to Henry Foss about possibilities," Victoria said, which was not quite an admission. "The actual decision is entirely yours." Eleanor looked at the room, at Greta and Ruth talking near the stove, at Cole Briggs explaining something to Edmund with gestures that suggested the subject was technical, at Doyle sitting in the corner looking like he was doing nothing and seeing everything, at Noah on the floor with the wooden horse, narrating something to it in the half-language that would be real sentences in another few months, already trying. "I'll talk to Henry," Eleanor said. The year that followed was not easy, but it was not the kind of hard that breaks things. It was the kind that builds muscle. The ordinary weight of a life with substance to it, the work and the decisions and the negotiations and the small daily achievements that don't make for dramatic stories, but that add up over time to something you can stand on. The new schoolhouse opened in April. 3 windows on the south side as planned, proper floor, the largest building on the main street now. Eleanor attended the opening with Noah, who was interested in the floor specifically, testing it with both feet as if assessing its structural integrity. The committee that had planned it had included Eleanor's insistence on a covered porch, so that children waiting in bad weather had somewhere to stand, which had been a practical argument and which had been adopted without much discussion. She didn't make anything of it. It was a porch. It was there. Victoria moved to Denver in June. Not far, 6 hours by coach on a good road, which meant she could and did come to Black Creek monthly, sometimes more often. Noah knew her arrival by sound before she appeared, the particular pattern of her knock, which was 3 times and then once more, which she had apparently developed without realizing it, and he moved toward the door with a speed he didn't produce for everyone. He called her Vicky, which she had not asked for and did not object to, which Eleanor thought was telling. Eleanor bought the parcel north of the lease. She negotiated the price herself, over 2 conversations with Henry Foss, and the second conversation was shorter than the first because she came to it better prepared, which was something she'd learned in Black Creek and would not have known how to do in Ohio. The new house was built over the summer, simple and solid, 2 bedrooms and a proper kitchen and a covered porch and windows that faced the mountains because she was tired of facing away from them. She and Noah moved in on a day in September that was clear and cold, the aspens on the upper slopes already turning gold. She stood in the main room of the new house the first evening and looked at the walls, which were bare, and thought about what she wanted to put on them. She thought about her mother's quilt, which was still in the trunk, which she had carried across 11 days of travel and which had never quite had the right place until now. She thought about the shelf she would build for Noah's room, at his height. She thought about the stove, which was new and would have its own mood she'd have to learn. She thought about 2 years ago. The cabin, the broken window with rags stuffed in it, the stove that ran hot on the right side. The first night on the cot with a baby she didn't know on her chest, and a life she hadn't planned spread out in every direction she looked. She thought about what she had assembled from that, piece by piece, in the imperfect way of someone who doesn't know what they're building until it's built. She was not done. That was the thing she had come to understand about the kind of work she'd been doing since she arrived in Black Creek. It didn't have a finished state, exactly. You didn't complete it and step back and admire it. You lived in it, and it changed as you changed, and there would be more years ahead with their own difficulties and their own kinds of accumulation, and she would not always handle them well. She would have bad weeks. She would make wrong decisions. There would be winter months and January mornings and things she hadn't thought to prepare for. But she was here. She had proven, at least to herself, that being here was something she was capable of. The sustained, unglamorous daily version of here, not the dramatic gesture, but the ordinary commitment. The thing that doesn't look like courage from the outside, but that requires, she had decided, more of it than anything else she knew. Noah appeared in the doorway of his new room. He'd been investigating it for the last hour with the thoroughness he applied to things that interested him, which was most things. "There's a window," he said, as if reporting. "I know," she said. "I had it put there." "It has the mountains," he said. "Yes." He considered this, standing in the doorway with the wooden horse in his hand. He was almost 3 now, and tall for it, with his dark eyes and the expression he wore when he was thinking. Slightly sideways, focused, the look of someone assembling information. "I like it," he said. "Good," she said. "That's why I got it." He went back to his investigation. She listened to his footsteps cross the new floor. Solid, the sound floors make when they're built right. And she looked at the bare walls of her own house, on the land that was her land, in the town that was her town as much as anywhere had ever been hers, and she let herself have for a moment the full weight of it. Not triumph, not arrival, just the solid, ordinary, difficult fact of having stayed. The mountains were out the front window. They were the same mountains they'd always been, enormous and permanent and indifferent, the kind of landscape that doesn't care about your story and will be there long after it's finished. Eleanor had stopped resenting that about them 2 years ago. She had started, somewhere in the middle of the second winter, to find it useful in the specific way that things are useful when they put you in your right proportion. The mountains did not care. The work still needed doing. Those two things together had a way of cutting through everything that wasn't essential. She had come west looking for a husband and a fresh start, and a life built on a promise. She had found instead a baby in a wooden crate, and 6 years' worth of hard seasons ahead of her, and the slow construction of something that couldn't be named in a letter or summarized in an advertisement. She had found that the things worth having almost never arrive the way you expected them to. She had found that you don't find a home. You build one, badly, and then better, with the materials available and the help you're willing to accept and the stubbornness to keep going when you're tired and nobody's watching and there's no guarantee it's going to hold. She had built this. She had built Noah Hayes, the specific small person currently cataloging the features of his new room with a wooden horse under his arm. She had built the shelf and the porch and the legal guardianship and the adoption and the network of people who had testified for her and brought soup and carved horses in their spare time and come to a dinner in a snowstorm on a March evening because something mattered enough to show up for. She hadn't done it alone. That was the other thing she'd learned, maybe the most important one, that the version of strength that is only ever alone is not the strongest version. She had been alone when she arrived, and she had chosen again and again and again, in small ways and large ones, to let people in. Ruth with her soup, Greta with her peaches, Herbert Crane with his notebook, Victoria with her board and her torn glove and her 3 returns into a burning building. That was the thing about this kind of life. You could not build it without other people. And letting other people in was the part that cost you, the part that required more courage than the hard winters and the bad weeks, and the legal processes and the fire combined, because letting people in meant being seen in the parts that were insufficient and trusting that what they saw would be enough. It had been enough. Not because she was extraordinary, she wasn't. She was a woman from Ohio who had run out of other options and stayed somewhere because there was a child who needed her. But because she had shown up and kept showing up, and the showing up had accumulated into something the people around her could recognize and trust. Outside, the aspens on the upper slopes were gold in the late light. The mountains were very clear. Somewhere down the hall, Noah was telling the wooden horse something about the window. Eleanor Hayes stood in her house and listened to her son's voice and watched the mountains hold their light for one more moment before the evening came on, and she let herself be, just for now, exactly where she was. It was enough. It had always been enough. She had just needed 2 years in Colorado to understand it.